Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our program is about to begin.
Good morning. Good morning. Welcome back. If everybody could come in here from out there and file and bring into the middle. I've been told to ask people to bring into the middle. So if you would be so kind as to get up and move to the middle, that would be great. I'm Evan Van Ness. I'll be your host for the morning. I am with Consensus and a newsletter called Week in Ethereum. weekinathereum.com. Let's see. And so I will be making the trains run on time today. Let's get started. Our first speaker is Will Warren, the co-founder and CEO of ZeroX, who will be talking about using meta models for cross-chain transactions. Welcome, Will.
Thank you. Hello, good morning. My name's Will. I'm from the ZeroX team. And before we get started, just want to thank the AraCon team for having me here to speak. Also want to thank the event organizers and volunteers. This is a really crazy event, really well done, so thank you. And also want to thank everyone here for arriving early. I know that 9 a.m.'s a little bit rough. So I'm going to be talking about how we can start thinking about governance systems when we move to a multi-blockchain or sharded blockchain world. So just a quick outline. I'm going to start off by kind of thinking about how we can kind of think about systems of smart contracts and how to kind of visualize them so that we can kind of think about these systems in kind of like a component-based way. Then we're going to talk about the motivation for cross-blockchain governance. We're going to talk about how we can model systems of Ethereum smart contracts. And then we're going to go into the details of how we can create a meta model. Okay, so we're going to be looking at many different diagrams in this presentation. Just about every slide has a diagram in it. So these diagrams are showing you a snapshot of the global state on the Ethereum blockchain, or a blockchain or shard, and the components that can exist within these virtual machines. We have two different components. We have externally owned accounts, which are, they have a public and private key pair associated with them, and these are like typical wallets. Then we have smart contracts, which are going to be represented by these gray rectangles. And then we're going to represent systems of smart contracts that might have many different components as just gray rectangles with a thick outline. And then interactions between these different components are shown as arrows that are directed from the caller to the callee. So smart contracts can call into another smart contract. We're going to represent that with an arrow. So how can we think about a governance system in kind of the highest level, most generic way? So we have a set of inputs. These inputs are fed into some arbitrary governance system. The inputs could be votes that are associated with on-chain identities. They could be token votes, they could be reputation, they could be anything. And the governance system could also be very complex and nuanced. We're going to represent it as just an arbitrary kind of black box. And then the governance system is controlling some sort of stateful system of smart contracts on the Ethereum blockchain. And the stateful system can be any arbitrary system. But for the purposes of this presentation, it's much easier to think about meta models and kind of this approach we're going to be talking about if we focus on a specific example. And so the specific example that we're going to focus on is 0x, because I'm kind of more familiar with that than most other systems. And so 0x protocol is a system that is used to facilitate the peer-to-peer exchange of digital assets on the Ethereum blockchain. And it is a stateful system that is governed. And at a high level, you can think of it as having a governance token. It's an ERC20 token. And these token balances are used to control a governance system, and it could be any arbitrary system. And then we have this canonical system of smart contracts that is actually facilitating the exchange of digital assets. So let's zoom in on the 0x pipeline and kind of see what's inside that black box. And as you can see on the right, we have a number of different Ethereum contracts that are all kind of interacting with each other. And you can think of this system as a pipeline, a modular pipeline that's broken into different segments. And governance allows us to add, remove, or replace these modules from the pipeline. And don't want to get into the lower level details of 0x because that's not really the focus of this presentation. But at a high level, you can think of how 0x works as this pipeline, these cryptographically signed orders, which kind of signal your intent to enter into a trade. These chunks of data enter on the left side into the exchange contract, and then a cascade of function calls kind of go down the pipeline, and then users' balances are modified at the right side of the pipeline. Okay, so we created 0x protocol on the Ethereum blockchain. We started working on 0x actually over 2 years ago at this point. And in the subsequent 12 months, a number of different EVM blockchains started to emerge. And we wanted to build this system that would allow you to exchange anything of value. And so, we're thinking about how can we take 0x and make it work on other blockchains as well. And so kind of the most naive approach is to just take this entire system, the governance token, the governance system, and then this pipeline, and just kind of copy and paste it onto every single blockchain. And the problem with this approach is that you end up with numerous different governance systems that exist in parallel, and this creates additional coordination costs. And if you have different governance systems, it's very likely that these governance systems may choose to go in different directions. So what you end up with are kind of these incompatible forks or different versions of this pipeline, and that creates an inconsistent user or developer experience. And if you have all of these different versions of the pipeline, you also have to, it creates duplicated effort because you have to have a different developer team maintaining all of these different copies. So this was kind of the initial motivation for thinking about cross-blockchain governance. But then, when it became clear that sharding is the direction that the space is going, it became much more urgent that we start thinking about how we can build these cross-blockchain governance systems. And the reason is because we're building all of these systems on the Ethereum blockchain today, but when we move to a sharded version of Ethereum, everything's going to break. And all the ways that we've been thinking about building dApps are going to have to change. So the problem we face when we move to a sharded blockchain, do we want to have this canonical system of smart contracts, this 0x pipeline, exist on a single shard and kind of force people to move their assets onto that shard? I don't think that makes sense. I believe that in order to have like a truly decentralized blockchain, we're going to have like some basic infrastructure that's available on every single shard. Otherwise, all of the dApps are going to want to co-locate on just one or two shards, and that kind of brings us right back to where we are today. So do we want to have, do we want to copy and paste 0x on all these different shards? It's the same exact problem as the problem we face with multiple blockchains. No, it doesn't make sense. We want to have a single governance system that allows every single shard to have a copy of this pipeline that is synchronized and consistent. Okay, so how can we build a system that allows every shard to receive updates and to be consistent with a single kind of model that we want them all to follow? And I think this kind of leads to an overarching question of how are we going to be designing dApps on sharded blockchains? We're going to have to move from a pattern of creating these kind of singleton infrastructure contracts that everyone uses, and we're going to have to move to a model where we really have these kind of drop-in modules that exist on all of these different shards in parallel. So this presentation is going to focus on how we can build one of these systems. So at a high level, the meta model is just a couple of extra layers that we add to our generic governance system. So we kind of taking this same approach that we started off with, we have a shard, and on that shard we have a number of different components. We have a governance token, and this governance token is controlling a governance system. And then this governance system is controlling what we're going to call a meta model. And this meta model describes a system of smart contracts in a way that is agnostic to any particular shard or blockchain and can be generalized to any of them. Then we have what we're calling a dispatcher. And a dispatcher looks at the meta model. Anytime the meta model is changed, it translates that generalized model, the changes to that generalized model, into the context of the local shard or blockchain that dispatcher is located on. Once it has translated those changes into the local address space, then it applies those changes to the stateful system of smart contracts, and that's how we kind of have synchronization of all these stateful systems across different shards or blockchains. Okay, so we're going to create a meta model, but before we can create a meta model, we kind of have to have just a basic model of the system of smart contracts that we want to focus on. So and we can do this by basically focusing on each individual component within the system in isolation. So every single smart contract basically has some basic things associated with it. It has an Ethereum address. It has some bytecode, which describes how it works, what does the code actually do. And then it has some internal state. And for 0x, the only internal state that we're really concerned with are these access controls between different contracts. So each contract within the 0x pipeline, it has an internal list of Ethereum addresses, and from which it is willing to accept incoming calls. Okay. And so we have this model. We have these kind of 3 chunks of data associated with each contract. And the problem with our model is that it's only valid for one specific shard. And the reason why is because Ethereum contract addresses are derived from the contract creator's address and the nonce associated with that address. So kind of putting it in more plain English, we take this contract and we deploy it to shards A and shard B. The contract is identical on either shard. It has the same exact bytecode, but the contract addresses are different on either shard. And so on the right, you can see a diagram. Let's say we want to add a new contract to our pipeline called Exchange version 3, and we want to point all of the other contracts in the system to Exchange version 3 to know that it's safe to accept incoming calls from this contract. Well, that works just fine for shard A, but the address of Exchange version 3 is different on shard B. So all of these contracts will be looking at a location on the blockchain where nothing exists. So if we want to create a meta model, or a model that is shard agnostic, contracts can't identify themselves or each other by address. Okay, so how do we make our model meta? We move from address space of the local shard or blockchain to what I'm calling code hash space. And so the code hash is a unique identifier that's derived from a contract's compiled source code. So in the image here, you can see on the left we have some Solidity source code. We're just going to write a smart contract. We're going to compile that source code, and we're going to get bytecode. And it's just a blob of data that describes how the contract functions within the EVM. And then we're going to take that bytecode and we're going to hash it. And we're going to end up with a 32-byte hash that is called the code hash. And so if we take the same exact contract, we deploy it on a bunch of different shards, or a bunch of different blockchains for that matter, and we use the same compiler, we use the same hashing function, it'll have the same exact code hash on every single shard or blockchain. And so EIP 1152 introduces a new opcode called xcodehash that allows contracts to easily inspect the code hash of other contracts. And so this is an important point. EIP 1152, I believe, is supposed to be included in Constantinople. Okay, so we have code hash. Now, how do we use this to create a meta model? What does a meta model actually look like? The meta model is just an Ethereum smart contract, and it does a couple of very simple things. It accepts instructions from our governance system. It stores a list of code hash indexed contracts. So we have components within our stateful system. It just stores them as code hashes. It identifies them as code hashes. And then it stores the access permissions between these different code hashes. And that's all it does. So you can see on the right, we have this model that we created of the 0x pipeline. We're looking at each smart contract individually, and there's this information associated with each one. And we're going to move from this model to a meta model, where we basically just have these code hashes that are linked to each other. And it's important to note that this meta model will be valid for every single shard or blockchain. Okay, so what are dispatchers and how do dispatchers work? So dispatchers are also just Ethereum smart contracts. But what they do is they translate these code hashes from code hash space back into the local address space of the shard or blockchain that they're located on. And so one problem here, it's very easy for smart contracts to inspect the code hash of a known address. So if I say, what's the code hash of this address right here, it can do that. But if we give a smart contract a code hash, it doesn't know where to find the contract associated with it. So we have to tell the dispatcher, this is Exchange version 3, and this is the bytecode associated with it, and it will verify that that's true, and it will add it into its own internal model, local model. So again, the dispatcher it's a single smart contract. There's one replica of it on every single chain, and it stores a list of the different components within the system, and it maps from their code hash to their address on the local chain. And it also stores these access permissions between these code hash indexed contracts. Or I guess it maps from one address to another address to show access permissions. And then finally, it applies updates. So anytime the meta model is changed, it sees that the meta model has changed, and it changes its own internal model. And then it applies that to the actual stateful system. So it actually calls into the stateful system to modify it so that it's consistent with the meta model. So how does the dispatcher dispatch these updates? So it's just a function call. So yeah, if you're going to register a new contract address with the dispatcher, so we've added Exchange version 3 to the meta model, and now we want to add Exchange version 3 to our local dispatcher. It basically is just going to verify that the code hash is consistent with the meta model. And then once it knows that, it will just call into the associated contract within the pipeline and make those updates as well. So I guess like a clear explanation is shown on the right. So we have this dispatcher, it's a smart contract, it has this internal model of how this 0x pipeline should look, how it's laid out on shard A. And then if we want to add Exchange version 3 and we want to tell this contract called ERC20 proxy to accept calls from Exchange version 3, then basically the dispatcher, once its internal model is updated, it will actually just call into ERC20 proxy, and it will update its internal access controls to accept calls from Exchange version 3. So that was a lot. There was a lot of stuff going on there, but if we put it all together, we started out with this kind of very simple diagram that shows these big chunks and how they're associated with each other. And if we kind of look back at what we've covered so far, and we kind of zoom in on each of the pieces, the meta model is just a single smart contract that exists on the same chain as the governance system, and it has this internal shard or blockchain agnostic meta model stored within. The dispatcher contract, there's one on every single shard or blockchain, and it also has an internal model, but it's taking the generalized version and it's translating that into the local address space, and then it is dispatching those updates onto the actual pipeline or stateful system. Okay, so on the right, you can kind of get even a more zoomed out picture of how this might look. So let's imagine that Ethereum 2.0 is here today. We have the beacon chain. Underneath it, we have all these shards. And we have one of the shards that has a governance token, a governance system, and a meta model. And all of the shards have a dispatcher that receives updates from the meta model, translates those updates into the local address space, and then applies those updates to its local stateful system. So there are certainly some constraints around when and where this kind of framework can be applied. So we have to have the same exact virtual machine running on any shard or blockchain that wants to have this kind of meta model approach. We must be able to, more generally, we must be able to prove to a dispatcher contract that the meta model has changed. So with a sharded blockchain, with homogeneous shards, it's pretty simple. All of the shards have the same exact virtual machine, and proving to the dispatcher that the meta model has changed is really just an asynchronous cross-shard call. So it's pretty straightforward. But meta models can also be applied pretty more or less easily for different blockchains that operate under a shared security model. So you can think of different EVM blockchains that might exist in Polkadot network. It gets a little bit harder to prove to a dispatcher that the meta model has changed if we're talking about blockchains that have their own security models, and proving that the meta model on one blockchain has changed to the dispatcher that exists on a different blockchain, and they have separate security models. It can be done though. It's probably going to be easier to prove for blockchains that have fast finality. But if we want to have a meta model that dispatches updates to blockchains with probabilistic finality, we could take an approach similar to BTC Relay, but it's very expensive. The Ethereum blockchain for BTC Relay, the Ethereum blockchain basically has to be running a light client of the Bitcoin blockchain in order to verify that a transaction has occurred on the Bitcoin blockchain. So it's pretty heavy, and there might be a way to use recursive snarks to more efficiently prove to a smart contract on Ethereum that something has occurred in a completely separate blockchain. And so Coda Protocol is kind of leading the charge on recursive snarks, and I would encourage you to check it out. So this is kind of what I have for this presentation today. But yeah, I just want to thank the AraCon team again for letting me speak here, and thank you for coming to see a presentation so early in the day. And then lastly, I just want to note that the 0x team is hiring. We just recently got a small office space in Full Node, and we're looking to get some passionate developers to join us here and in San Francisco. So you can see the roles that we have open on our website, 0x.org. So thank you.
All right. Next up, we have a panel on decentralized organizations, governance, and decentralized organizations. So let's welcome our panel moderator to the stage, Allison Berriman from ETH News. And our panelists, Constance Choi, the co-founder and director of the Koala Foundation, Kenny Rowe, the vice president at AraCon Cooperative, and Mario Lau, a researcher at Placeholder. Welcome.
Hi. So, like Evan Van Ness liked to tell everybody, we're talking about governing decentralized organizations. So let's just start out by introducing ourselves. So I guess was formerly, up until about a week ago, I was working for ETH News as an editor there. And that's kind of where I fell in love with the topic of governance in this space. And that led me to where I am now, which is at Blockchains LLC as a researcher in governance to figure out how to, or to help figure out how to run that organization.
Yeah, I'm Kenny Rowe. I started my career out in MakerDAO, did some consulting for a little while, and currently I'm VP at AraCon Cooperative.
All right, my name is Mario Lau. I'm currently on a 5-month pause from working in this space, but as said, I have worked as a researcher for Placeholder and will continue doing that full-time starting in March, focusing on governance. And I did my graduate degree in technology governance, which has obviously acquired a whole new dimension for me in the past couple of years. So yeah, excited to talk about the topic.
Hi, I'm Constance. I'm a co-founder director of Koala Foundation. We are a multi-stakeholder group. We bring together kind of the best and brightest of researchers from various disciplines and try to work on hard problems for the ecosystem. Before that, I was a co-founder and general counsel, chief compliance officer of the Kraken cryptocurrency exchange. And before that, I worked at major law firms, litigating cases, issues of first impression, whether YouTube could exist, what is novel and patentable, and also at the EFF, where I worked at the intersection of civil rights and our lives on the internet.
Sweet. All right, so to start us out, so decentralized governance models seem to be gaining traction across industries, but what problems do you see as unique to smart contract-based decentralized organizations that require new innovations?
Let's go first.
Well, I think the context to which the question is framed, so you've got governance and decentralized organizations, which may or may not be governed by a blockchain, but for this argument, we'll say that they're governed by smart contracts, so they've got let's say deterministic. If you put something in, you get something specific out. And in this case, it's going to be who has access to put in these inputs? What's the process by like human consensus that we're talking about in order to make some sort of decision about how we're all going to act together? So I think one of the interesting questions that you have to kind of wrap your head around when it comes to smart contracts is sort of these access control issues. So are these multi-sigs that are some multiple agents in a trusted or hierarchy of an organization that are actually trying to represent a larger group? That's like one question you could ask. Or is it even a single one, or is there a contract, like a governance contract that has popular vote or some of these other things? So I suppose the question meaning is, in the governance of smart contracts, what's your governance structure going to be, and how are you going to lay that out? And that's usually, you get two parts of that design question and then like the human question. I think those two things often can result in some tension.
Yeah, I think the problem or challenges for decentralized smart contract-based governance are actually not that different from the challenges of governance of traditional organizations. So, for example, if you look at, try to get a bit theoretical here from a social scientific point of view, but if you look at how governing organizations has worked for the past, 100, 150 years, starting with industrialization, it's been what sociologists call the legal rational way of organizing humans and arranging organizational structures. And the typical type of organization that we associate with this form of doing things is a bureaucratic organization. And one way that I've recently been thinking about smart contract based or decentralized algorithmically done governance is that they're essentially automated bureaucracies, if you think about it. I think the word bureaucracy has a little bit of a bad connotation, but I think that's for a reason, obviously, because bureaucracies can devolve into a very inflexible and dehumanized context of arranging things. But on the other hand, there's a reason why the modern world is built on these types of organizations, because they are, to our best knowledge, the most efficient way to organize. Using the word efficient and bureaucracy in the same sentence may sound weird, but there's a case there, I think. And so when you think about how to set up these organizations or networks that are governed algorithmically, I think the challenges are essentially the same, and I agree with what Kenny was saying, that you really need to define exactly the roles in the system and what happens when and who has the rights, etc., which is exactly the same what you would do in a traditional setting, where you set up either a corporation or a public institution or whatever, where you want to take the subjective aspects out and you want to make sure that everything is done. There's a word for it, it's called the protocol. Right? In bureaucratic organizations, you also have the protocol, the way of doing things. And it's, if you think about the expression code is law, then it becomes, to me at least, very obvious that it's really dealing with the exact same thing, kind of.
Yeah, I would echo actually what you guys both said. I think that a large part of blockchain governance or decentralized governance narrows the topic to smart contracts or on-chain governance. And I think we to take a step back, when we're talking about governance, we're talking about a lot more than decision making and dispute resolution. These are really reductive kind of forms of governance. There's all sorts of questions of how does a decision come to a vote? Who has the right to speak? Who are legitimate stakeholders? How is common knowledge formed and among whom? Is there a procedural fairness? All these sorts of issues are fundamental to the issue of governance before you even get to how are votes calibrated and counted from whom. So I think that a large part of the focus has been around decision making and how to create that in code. And I think more attention should be paid to kind of all of the norms, assumptions, and culture that bring to bear before decisions are taken. And also, when we're talking about governance, it's really a two-part thing. It's the decision-making apparatus and also the sense-making apparatus. So a lot of focus, I think, and I think that this is not unique to blockchain governance, but I think very, very important because we're talking about reaching consensus among unknown participants in this disintermediate, decentralized world, is how do we refine and create the appropriate sense-making apparatus so that the participation is of a quality and with knowledge and with legitimacy. And I think that's super important for any blockchain governance protocol.
Yeah, kind of picking up on that, actually, what relationship do you see between cultural and social norms and governance models in these decentralized organizations, or in what ways can decentralized governance or a governance model influence social and cultural norms, and should they? Or how do you see those things interacting?
Yeah, I think it's basically inevitable that they do, because any project starts out not as this mass scale thing where you have, a lot of people involved. It starts out as something that is started by a smaller group of people, often a single individual with an idea, an ideology, a vision for the project, and that vision is often carried by like fundamental values or norms of what the world should look like. So, if you look at open source development projects, it's a very similar situation where because these projects are at least initially based on volunteer contributions, your norms and values and your vision for the project has to attract people on the basis of non-financial basis or non-commercial basis. So I think it's kind of inevitable that you have that, but as the project grows and the more people get involved, these underlying values that were there initially may change, either organically, via governance mechanism or whatever, or they could change through conflict. So yeah.
And something interesting to note about most of these organizations is even when they're small, they're usually almost always global by default. Which, when you think about that, just as how we interact normally, like everyone here mostly has some at least cultural references to, let's just call it like Western society. We know how to interact with each other, generally speaking, and not have too much confusion. But when you start to begin to have global communities, and the typical means of communication is text-based, you have all kinds of cultural just miscommunications at really fundamental levels. I've experienced this quite often with either talking with folks from Asia or from other countries where we just even though we're speaking English, we're not speaking the same language, but we've got to coordinate at a level to get something done. And sometimes it can be easier to coordinate on something as sort of abstract as a smart contract, because if everyone can understand that a vote is happening at this time, they've got to figure out how to interact with the blockchain. But that's almost easier than discussing the issue of why we're voting in the first place. Right?
Governance, I think, at its very core is a social process. So, how we kind of negotiate the social space, communicate, reach consensus, these things are really fundamental and come before, actually, the protocol itself. So I think it's super important, actually, to look at what is the underlying social layer that we are now automating, that we are now making more transparent and efficient, and make sure that we're making this the correct logical leap. Because if you create a super efficient automated system on top of a really messed up social layer, you're going to get a very totalitarian and wrong system, right? So these questions are super important. And I think there needs to be a lot more done on kind of how we mediate our social interactions. How do we deal with in-group and out-group dynamics? Ironically, a lot of these projects are so focused on censorship resistance, which is a super important feature. But the corollary to censorship resistance is how do we remain inclusive of people to have the ability to speak in the first place? So, dealing with the gatekeeping function on the social layer from the very beginning, I think is extremely important. We're going to import a lot of our old ideals, and I think it requires us to be very, very thoughtful about what kinds of values we're bringing into the space, not just the lip service, but really on a fundamental level. Are we listening to others? Are we taking up too much space? Are we approaching ideas with a sense of collaboration rather than a zero-sum competition? These are things that I think need to be addressed on an individual level, on a meta level, and I think organizations like AraCon setting the values early on, setting the culture early on, while we're experimenting with various governance models, I think sets a lot of the soft power and all the social layer from the very beginning that will then influence the kinds of rules that we come up with. On a basic level, we have off-chain governance and on-chain governance mechanisms, and we're going to have to do a lot of experimentation to figure out which features we want to import from different mechanisms. So on-chain governance, you have efficiency and transparency of process, but they're not so great with dealing with nuance or changing conditions. On the other hand, you have off-chain governance, which allows for us to communicate, deal with human subjectivity, negotiate the social space. But these things are less transparent, more easily gameable. So how do we create hybrid systems that help us leverage technology to do what it does best, and then leverage humans to do what they do best? And how do we negotiate the power dynamics between each of these features?
Yeah, I very much agree with that. And coming back to my earlier example about these on-chain governance, smart contract-based, algorithmic, semi-automated governance systems being sort of like bureaucracies. I mean, we're in Berlin. There was a very famous German sociologist called Max Weber, who was one of the most famous theorizers of bureaucratic organizations, and he said that even though bureaucracies are extremely efficient, they can also he used the expression, turn into the polar night of icy darkness, and he likened it to an iron cage where people get entrapped, and it's super efficient, but it's dehumanized, so to speak. So I agree with what you were just saying, that we need to be careful that we don't turn these automated governance systems into silicon cages where we don't have this option to fall back on, like the flexibility of human subjects, the flexibility that they can bring into governance. So yeah, I agree with that very much.
So one of the main, I guess, promises that people see with decentralized organizations is that they hope that they'll help create a more fair and equal world. But do you think that decentralized organizations are fundamentally any better or worse at dealing with inequalities in resource and power distribution?
I don't know. I mean, it remains to be seen, really, of how well they distribute power and how well they distribute resources. One thing we do know about them is that they operate at a different level than either a local government or a national government, right? So if we're talking about, well, is it possible that smart contracts and decentralized governance might empower people in rural communities in Africa alongside domestic urbanites in America? Yeah, that's very possible that some combination of interest between those two parties can collaborate on an equal playing field to mutual benefit. Yes, I hope that is true. But there does seem to be some conflict, or at least some reason to believe that maybe that one, it might be very difficult to reach that or cross that digital divide. There's also an enormous learning curve for folks that are coming up, and they're not going to have as many resources. So whatever they bring to bear is going to be largely either a function of their intelligence or not necessarily their intelligence, but whatever the local knowledge that they have, that interacting with that smart contracts. And if they're at a disadvantage already because of either access to information or education or whatever, it seems to me that we still have some work to do in order to make sure that these groups do interact to mutual benefit.
Yeah, I think every decentralized network inevitably has an unequal distribution of power and resources in the beginning to start with, and that's like base point of departure inevitably feeds into the way decisions are made in the about how the network should evolve or how it should be governed. So one way to think about governance is exactly that, meaning governance is a way for those who have an active interest in the status quo to defend themselves against those who want to change the system, and also vice versa. So a good governance process allows for change, but at the same time doesn't make it too easy either to keep it stable in the longer time frame. So I think resource distribution and power dynamics, I've written a blog post about this as well if anyone's interested. I think it's an essential thing that we should be thinking about when we think about how these systems are governed.
I think we all know the great promise of blockchain is this permissionless, global, open coordination network. And it offers all sorts of new opportunities for communities to express their own values, to scale, to interact with each other on a more transparent basis. But I think that at the end of the day, I think it's really important to remember that technology is ultimately a tool, and a tool is wielded by human beings. And
only fools worship their tools.
Well said. Well said. So there's a sense sometimes I hear this a lot that a technological process is value neutral, that you can create neutral platforms. Technology doesn't operate in a vacuum. So, social media platforms, the internet, these things are not just neutral facilitators that just gather, human activity in a vacuum. There's a context in which this information is collected, analyzed, measured, manipulated, and monetized. So for any kind, when we, in the absence of a thoughtful design to the contrary, a technology platform that is on its face neutral will facilitate default modes. So default power structures, default modes of access. So we have to really interrogate, how the extent to which we say that the systems that we create are really just analysis and mirror of factfulness. Because a lot of what we do right now as we interact on the internet, all of this data and metadata that is feeding up these algorithms, our systems, our reputation systems, our protocols, these are not value neutral. So I'm just going to give you a great example of this. Twitter is now being touted as the barometer of public opinion. Large data sets that are collected from Facebook activity are being analyzed by governments, by academia, by businesses as the truth of human behavior. And that all of the underlying assumptions, all of that human activity has been produced through existing productions of power, if that makes sense. So on one hand, we say, if we were to say Twitter is the barometer of public opinion, knowing that 15% of adults, of people online are on Twitter, only 8% of that number actually are active. And if we were to say, okay, from the datafication, from our idea that now everything can be measured from all of this activity, if we consider that the truth, then we're having a very, very myopic, narrow view of what public human activity is, what public activity is. So as we're building these technological tools, these platforms, just realize that anything that's neutral is going to support the status quo and current power dynamics. The market isn't really free, so it's super important to be thoughtful about how the assumptions that we're making about how humans behave and what humans are capable of in order to make sure these technological tools are in the service of greater empowerment and not just ossifying or bureaucratizing or making more efficient existing inequalities.
All right, a little overrated, underrated. What do you think is a problem with governing decentralized organizations that is overrated?
An overrated problem?
Yeah, something that you think is not as big of a problem as the rest of people seem to think.
It's an interesting question. I think, we do talk a lot about mechanism when we're thinking about decentralized governance. Well, how are we going to do things? And that seems to dominate a lot of the conversation, at least in the beginning. I found well, how are we going to do this? Or even maybe how are we going to change it? I do think, though, at some point, you should just sort of, you got to just do something. Like we talk about experimentation, and one of the ways you experiment is just, try it out.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not maybe it's not an overrated problem, but you shouldn't go through some sort of analysis like paralysis from just trying to figure out what to do. Just put something together and see what's going to happen, but just keep in a frame of mind that, what do you want this to do? How other ways might it fail? And what are the ways we can change it to make it better?
Yeah, I was about to say something very similar. I think making things overly complex unnecessarily. I think, being maybe a bit too obsessed about trying to engage everyone in I mean, it's obviously important to be able to engage people and have them participate in governance, but people don't necessarily know how to do that if there's no clarity about what the process is or is supposed to. So obviously it takes time to build. It's just like an organic process that takes time, but I think focusing more on being very clear about what the process is, or at least proposing a very clear process to begin with, instead of trying to, that's my personal opinion, trying to get through signalings and things, like trying to settle on a governance process. I think it makes it overly complex a bit, instead of sitting down and putting a clear thing out there, and then also introducing a process of how to change that process if that is not acceptable to the participants, because I think people often don't know what they want necessarily, or they need a starting point, and then they can kind of iterate from that.
I think trustlessness is overrated. I think actually Bruce Schneier, wonderful cryptographer and thinker, his blog is amazing. He was speaking at one of our events recently, and he said, I woke up and I trust. He said, I trust. On my way to this conference, I trusted about 1,000,000 things today. I trusted that the cab was going to take me where it was going to go. I trusted that the lights worked on the road. I trusted, that these things operated. So trust is actually super important, and we forget that because I think because we're a bit traumatized from the world, and we sometimes want to negotiate this space, with this specter of a trustless technology that will somehow correct all the errors of human judgment. So I think that's a fallacy. I think that doesn't exist. I mean, if you look at the Bitcoin protocol, for example, there are lots of philosophical underpinnings that led to particular decisions, and which is why people agree with that model or not. So I think that this idea of trustlessness, I think, is quite overrated. I think, and echoing what you guys said, I think it's super important to experiment and build, because we don't actually know what works yet. So I know Gnosis is doing a lot of incredible work on trying to figure out how to optimize various governance structures for what. So, you have certain processes that might allow, quick updates and changes. You have certain processes that allow for more participation and deliberation. We need to, simulate, experiment, and figure out how these work in practice and scale. So, there's a lot of work to be had on that front.
All right, what about underrated problems? What do you think that people are missing that we really should be paying attention more to?
That you need rules about the rules. or how to change the rules. You need rules about that. So it's one thing to create a protocol and say that it's trustless and operates on its own, but you can't take the human element completely out, because if you want to change that, you still need to have that human process where you need to have some sort of a trusted environment where people can do that without that there is a process for doing that in a legitimate and acceptable way. So I think the need to have a clear process in place to change the rules. I think that's maybe a bit. I don't know if it's underrated, because it's becoming painfully obvious to everyone. I think that you need that. Yeah.
I think the idea of legitimacy is somewhat underrated, because we can get preoccupied with different mechanisms, but it really doesn't matter which mechanism ultimately gets instantiated if nobody thinks it's a legitimate process, or if there's enough people that don't think it's legitimate, that they don't follow whatever the decision was made. So it is really important, and I think legitimacy is somewhat more social than it is, written down in a process. So and that's an issue of communication, that's an issue of buy-in, that's an issue of participation. All of those things go into legitimacy before a process is really adhered to and is useful. If it doesn't have that, it's really not useful.
A lot of times, a lot of people have gotten into the space for various reasons, to address inequality, to make more open systems, to challenge the establishment and status quo. And again, I think it's really focusing on the social layer that's been, severely underrated. I think it's really important to remember that it's not a dichotomy of an individual versus a state, or an individual versus a corporation. Often, we see these technologies or these spaces as kind of negotiating the two ends of the spectrum. I think what's really important is and this has been happening now for millennia, as we move from centralized feudal, systems into more fair, equitable, transparent, procedural systems. This idea of creating that there's a new social space that is between an individual and a person of power, and that social space is actually not just the collective, so to speak. It's not just something that needs to be negotiated and disciplined and controlled and extracted. It's actually a place where it's a new space where we're kind of learning how to be together, negotiate our individual needs against the needs of the collective. And that space that we're creating and institutionalizing is a place where power is also produced. So we need to be thoughtful about what kinds of social structures are we supporting and producing as we're creating new mechanisms for that shared space. And I just, there's this wonderful excerpt from, I'm sure many of you have read Yuval Harari's Homo Sapiens, where he talks about how the lion walks in the jungle and is really secure in his state on top of the food chain. And you have many thousands of years of millions of years of evolution. They kind of know where they are. And on the other hand, you have human beings who with the use of tools have gotten up to the food chain relatively quickly. And we haven't really had generations of feeling very confident in our status. And so we still bring a lot of our same kind of zero-sum survival, kind of bottom of the Maslow hierarchy of needs thinking to bear. So, as we create this new social space, as we build these tools that help us mediate and promote individual freedom in that space, just be really, really careful about what kinds of values, biases, assumptions that we're bringing into it, so we can actually create something new and better.
Kind of playing off of that. Decentralized organizations are entirely reliant on participation of the community, and right now, it seems like a lot of DAOs are struggling with voter participation or community participation. What could be done to increase participation by the community, and what's lost if we fail to do that?
Well, I think when you talk about voter participation, I think you really do need to separate that between people who are interested in governance and an application and token holders. They are very different groups of people. Token holders, for the most part, are interested in making money, and they don't particularly care too much about a lot of the other issues. So it can be a little disingenuous when you say there's low voter turnout. Well, it could just be investors don't care to vote. That could be the same issue. So I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I think increasing participation is the thing that we do want to look at, but we do need to keep in mind that some of these groups have very different motivations for what they're doing, and how to reach them is going to be potentially very different.
It's kind of a bit counterintuitive, because the people who presumably are in it for the money, I mean, you would assume that they would have an interest in how the project develops, and like participating in governance gives you the opportunity to have a say in that. So yeah, it's a tough one. I think there's it's very difficult to stay up to speed on everything that goes on in the world in general, and even in a single area, and even in a single network. So if you're not engaged on a daily basis, then it's the same old problem that you have with political participation in the traditional world. It's not easy, so you need to find a way to kind of effectively communicate in the right way at the right times, make sure that people understand what's going on, and incentivize. You want people to be internally motivated to participate. So if I tend to be a bit skeptical about trying to enforce some kind of maybe an artificial incentive mechanism to force people to vote. So I think trying to do as good of a job as possible in explaining and being clear about what the vision of the project is, and if people buy into that, they hopefully will be more active participants in governance as well.
I think legitimacy is actually really core to this question. Who are decisions legitimate? If carried out, in what way? Was there enough participation for this to be legitimate? There's a lot of debate and discussion around, who has enough stake or skin in the game to be able to participate. And I think we just need to do a lot of. It's an open question. How do you balance inclusiveness with consensus and leadership and legitimacy? And these will take a lot of different experiments. I know DAO Stack is doing some really great work on holographic and holonic, governance models. How do you let dissenting opinion coalesce into consensus? How do you prevent consensus and leadership from turning into hegemony? And these are kind of age-old questions that hopefully with all of these new models and the speed at which we can now experiment and test these things, maybe we can get something closer to a fair model.
I'll add just one thing. I think there's also nothing wrong in getting more used to or accepting the idea that not all people, people want to necessarily all the time actively participate in governance, but they want to have the opportunity to do that if they see things going in the wrong way. So, yeah, I mean, we would want to see maximum levels of political participation, but I'm not saying that it is unrealistic. I'm just saying that it's worth considering that it may not be the normal thing for people to do.
For sure. All right, looks like time is up, but thank you guys so much, and thank you guys. And if you, what's up? Oh, I don't know. Do we have time for questions?
No.
So if you want to ask questions, you can come find us. Sorry. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Allison and panelists. Next up, we have a brief history of decentralized thought. Daniel from Pando, take it away.
Okay. Good morning. Seems that today many people claim they want to decentralize everything from the state to the brain. So I'm going to put some scrutiny on this thought and we'll, thank you, quickly go over the history of decentralization. But before that, I want to take the chance that we're so many people here to gather some anthropological data. I want you to please scan this QR code. It will lead you to a page. Go to the bottom, say you don't have an account, and put this code in. I want to just gather from you what is your go-to example of decentralization or... Cool. So what is your example of decentralized governance or decentralized thought? For me, a few examples that came to my mind. Let me go a bit more for you. So for me, it comes the kibbutz, Rojava, BitTorrent, parody utopias, markets, and Zapatistas. Now, the history of decentralized governance is not something that they're going to teach you in school. It's not very prominent in the mainstream media, and they don't talk a lot about it in academic papers. The reason for this is that historically, history is written by the victors, and those who could write it, and moreover could be read by large sections of the population, were often part of clerical, statal, or tribal elites, and they had no incentive to go against this narrative. Of course, in the last 100 years, from Daniel Bell to Alvin Toffler, the word decentralization has been increasingly used, and it's even at the cornerstone of the EU subsidiarity principle, which is a fundamental law of the EU. The first person to use it in the semantic way we mean it today was philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville. So what he observed was that with the rise of the nation state and modernity, decentralization went from being a descriptive property of bureaucracies and administrations to an object of political contention, and it even became a state dogma, for example, for the Jacobins after the revolution. When he talks about it, he advocates for decentralization. What he says is that decentralization has not only administrative value, it also has a civic dimension, since it increases the opportunities for citizens to take interest in public affairs. It makes them accustomed to using freedom, and from the accumulation of these local, active, personal-key freedoms is born the most efficient counterweight against the claims of the central government, even if it were supported by an impersonal collective will. This impersonal collective will is very close to what we think today about decentralized consensus. So what at the end of the day makes a community decentralized? There are many properties, and there are too many to enumerate here, but Vitalik in his article, What is Decentralization? He goes over three big ones. Architectural decentralization, this is the tolerance to, for example, a network, several agents being down. There is logical decentralization, which has the question, is the data ontology interpretation monolithic or not? So all the user balance is the same for all the nodes in the network, or is it like language where you can have multiple interpretations? Of course, the most important one that has already been very much discussed here is political decentralization, so the decentralization of power. How do we define this? Well, Niall Ferguson is a historian, but what he says about decentralization and hierarchy is that we think about hierarchies as vertically structured organizations characterized by centralized and top-down command and control and communication. From being the opposite of a network, a hierarchy is just a special kind of network. There's only one path connecting any two nodes, which clarifies chains of command and communication. More importantly, the top node has the highest betweenness and closeness centrality. That is, the system is designed to maximize that node's ability both to access and to control information. Think of a pure hierarchy as in some sense anti-random, in that the promiscuous connectivity associated with the networks, above all clustering, is prohibited. What is important here is to think about the system is designed for centrality. Now, I want us to be very careful. Let's not vilify and be against the word power. Power can also have very positive meaning. It is the capacity for humankind to act onto its environment. What is to be denounced is not hierarchy and power. It is forms that are and systems that are designed to maximize power. It is illegitimate forms of power. Now, how do we measure this thing? And it's important for us to measure, because if we don't have empirical data, we can't have a discussion together. One of the measures that was proposed to measure decentralization in blockchain networks was by Balaji Srinivasan and his colleague, the Nakamoto coefficient. The Nakamoto coefficient just looks at different facets of a crypto network. So for example, miners, clients, developers, and it asks, well, if you remove one tomorrow morning, what happens to the network, and how many of them are useful to control the network? So imagine you woke up tomorrow and there's no Bitcoin Core client, or there's no Infura. Clearly, today we haven't gotten to the level of decentralization we want yet. But even if we do get to that level, what does it mean? The historical record shows that always one group of power leaders replaces the other. Hannah Arendt very astutely observed that the most ardent revolutionary will wake up a conservative the day after the revolution. So what we must do is actually be transparent about our goals, discuss them, and come to this consensus and try to inscribe them into the protocol itself. Now, it's not necessarily at the base layer, but we have to come to some sort of agreement. These goals can be very contradictory. We've seen what happened with the discussion with Vlad and Nick, and I think what Nick approaches is to say that any form of governance will inevitably result in an encroachment on the sovereignty of the individual. On the other side, you have goals which could be like, what greed renders desirable, coal must make unattainable. Of course, between these two visions, you have all the colors of the political spectrum. Fortunately, we're not in a violent system. We're usually between these two propositions, shit happens and heads roll. So what we must do is not be dogmatic. We must experiment, and we must try out different systems to see which ones suits best our needs. This dogmatism also has to extend to the notion of decentralization itself. So it is not in itself a goal. I mean, it is a goal, but it's not an end. It is only a means to get to our end. And if we're thinking about what level of decentralization we need optimally for an organization, we have to look at the pros and the cons of it. So I'll very fastly go over them. There is low cost of coordination. So think about markets. You can coordinate millions of agents that don't know the state of the world or each other's intentions, and yet with a few variables they can come to a rational decision. There is a huge resiliency. If you try to shut down Bitcoin by closing down a node, it's like chopping the head off a hydra. And of course, you can circumvent the local knowledge problem. What this means is that by delegating decisions to those who are closer to them, you can get more accurate and relevant decisions. This is one of the local knowledge problem is one of the big problems with centralized planning, for example, in the Soviet Union. On the other side, there are huge trade-offs to decentralization. Think about a command and control protocol, such as an army. In only 3 messages, you can go from the field soldier to the chief of staff of the army. But in a decentralized network, it is much slower to propagate it. This is directly related to the decentralization, security, scalability trilemma. There is also the appearance of local fiefdoms. I don't have to go over what happened in the last few years in the blockchain space, but because you remove an actor such as the state that is able to arbitrate and even be abusive, you also remove that accountability. So people can be driven by economic incentives to maximize their profit for their own gain at the detriment of the network as a whole. Of course, you also have a problem of the tyranny of structuredness, which is that if you remove the jury hierarchies, you end up as in a dinner party with sometimes somebody monopolizing the whole attention and de facto taking the leadership. Now, what does this mean for projects in the crypto space? Do we want to have, the charismatic leadership of Vitalik, who tries to step back from this position, or benevolent dictatorship of Linus Torvalds? I would advocate modestly for more democratic and organic forms of governance. This is very modestly what Pando is trying to do, and I won't go into the details of this. But I think what we all advocate for is changing society. How we change society, though, is not in the old vanguard party top-down moralizing model. It has to be bottom-up, building tools that people can empower themselves and take power over back their production. Of course, technology is not neutral, but I don't have time to go into this, but I would advise you to read this book, Protocol, How Control Exists After Decentralization, by Galloway. That was from 2004, but really sees what happened in this space. So I will go straight to the takeaways from this. First, that initial decentralization can quickly lead to re-centralization. Tocqueville again talks about this. He says that what in the beginning was a push for decentralization became in the end an extension of centralization. In starting, one follows the logic of one's principles. In finishing, one follows that of one's habits, of one's passions, of power. In sum, the last word always remains with centralization, which, to be honest, increases in depth at the same time it decreases in appearance. So let's not just decentralize, let's remove the ability for us to re-centralize power in our hands. The second thing, which I've already talked about, is that balance is key. And this balance between centralization and decentralization doesn't have to be an obsession. It can be about creating nested systems. So for example, you could have an ecosystem funding hyperdAO that itself is decentralized and allocates things without anyone having the power over this decision. And yet it can delegate some actions and some sub-budget to sub-entities, such as sub-DAOs, holacracies, companies, contractors, whatever form you want. The third is that you gotta be decentralized on all layers. We've seen in the Nakamoto coefficient that one stakeholder can decentralize the network, but think about nested protocol hierarchies. For example, if somebody could control TCP/IP, a miner could reroute packages more favorably to himself. If you're using centralized storage, then you are also vulnerable to that, and that's why the work of Espresso and Altea yesterday was really impressive in this regard. The fourth thing is that existing institutions will try to react. They can try to regulate and repress these things, but more usually they will commercialize it, they will package it, they will give convenience to the tool, and they will subvert the initial values. This is what happened with the movement from Web 1.0 to Web 2. And today the Web 3 has been called a movement for counter anti-disintermediation. Lastly, decentralization is building decentralized system and establishing DAOs is a very multifaceted affair. So you have to consider the whole taxonomical space. What I mean is that there is not just, you have to think about, is my vision a narrow or wide vision of decentralization, but am I thinking about other properties, such as autonomy? I will leave you now on a few words from the original Taoist master, Lao Tzu, and I thank you for your time.
We good? All right. Next up is a panel on a very important topic, near and dear to all of our hearts, open source sustainability, with our moderator, AraCon co-founder, Luis Quende. Come on up. And our panelists, Aya Miyaguchi from the Ethereum Foundation, Olivier from Pando, Taylor from MyCrypto, and Yandon from LivePeer. Take it away.
There will be Q&A.
Yeah, there will be Q&A. Cool. Welcome everyone to this panel. For me, it's kind of a dream panel for open source sustainability because I think we have the best people on earth that could talk about this. And I think just introducing yourselves in like 15 seconds will be really useful for people to know more. So you wanna go first, Aya?
Okay. Hello everyone. My name is Aya Miyaguchi. I'm executive director of the Ethereum Foundation. For people who do not know very much about what the foundation does, I think a lot of people actually do not know. We support, I think our role has shifted, or I believe our role should shift, but the foundation is the originally founded to build Ethereum, and then now it is not only the EF who is building Ethereum. So now our role is, the main role is to support all the ecosystem players to work with us or work with other players to finish building Ethereum. So all the activities that is related to that, we do that, including communication, education, grant program. Yes.
Thank you. Olivier?
Yes, so I'm Olivier. I'm the lead dev of Pondo, which is a decentralized.
I don't know if
Is it working?
Hello, hello.
Usually when I talk, there are all the technical problems, so that.
Huh.
Well,
maybe.
It's
Yeah.
oh, I
Is it
think
working
it's
now? Okay, nice.
yes.
So, hi everyone. So yes, I'm Olivier. I'm the lead dev of Pondo, which is a decentralized versioning system, like a decentralized alternative to Git, which is funded by an AraCon Nest grant. And yeah, so we are trying to tackle the problem of open source sustainability by developing some kind of dependency and contribution tracking system, which allows to track, okay, who has contributed to what are the dependencies of my repo, what other repo I have forked at some point, and to keep track of all this relation between all the repos on chain, so that if one of them gains an income at some point by magic, it can be split and flow up to the dependency tree. So it's a way to kind of try to solve this open source sustainability issue that way. But
Thanks, Olivier. Taylor?
Awesome. Hi, I'm Taylor Monahan. I am the founder and CEO of MyCrypto. Previously, I founded My Ether Wallet. Both are completely open source projects. I actually didn't have a lot of experience in open source before starting My Ether Wallet and then MyCrypto. So it's been a pretty magical experience, I would say. Especially moving from the mentality that you have to build the moats and everything should be private and this is your property and it's secret and that's what gives it value, to pretty much the exact opposite, where our products are powerful and valuable for completely different reasons, and we can give all the source code and even the compiled code out for free and put it on the internet, and that actually enhances the product and the project and the company, and it makes it more valuable. So hopefully I can speak a little bit more about that today.
Thanks, Taylor. Very curious about that. Jondon?
Hey everyone, my name is Yandin. I'm a researcher and software engineer at LivePeer, which is working on decentralized video streaming infrastructure. So probably of most relevance to this panel, we're pretty interested in being able to create sustainable open source video streaming software at LivePeer. But in the past, previous to LivePeer, I had also done some studies on sustainable open source funding models as a part of my undergraduate thesis. So I spent some time learning and exploring that area, and that was ultimately motivated by identifying that open source software is kind of the fundamental fabric of everything that we're building for this more and more digital society. So it's an interesting problem space to explore with everyone.
Yeah, so going back to that actually, so one of the aha moments that I had with open source sustainability was actually reading Open Collab's white paper by Jondon, which is like a very short paper, as like the very good papers are, such as Bitcoins. But really opened my eyes, because something that is very interesting, and I want your opinion on this, but basically something that happens in the crypto space is that we are solving the tragedy of the commons, but at the same time, the core protocols that we have that are supposed to solve the tragedy of the commons are having the tragedy of the commons themselves. So we're having this very ironic situation where sometimes the protocols that power a blockchain, for example, are either underfunded or we don't really have enough eyes on them. So I'm very curious to think, what is your take on open source sustainability for crypto? And I think we can just go in order and have like a quick overview of what you think about open source sustainability and why it is important in the crypto space.
Should I start? I think, we are building this system to make the world more distributed or decentralized, like power should be distributed and also decentralized. And with that, that is our vision. And then with that, it's very, very important to keep this technology open source. If we have small numbers of big powers control this or own this, it will defeat the purpose. And then so even Ethereum, like when the foundation was founded, like we don't own Ethereum. No one owns Ethereum. That's why. Otherwise, I don't think this ecosystem has evolved this big. So we've seen the power of open source, and then all the projects that even the one that are within, like you think are our in-house project, which such as gas or like none of those projects are only done by the members of the Ethereum Foundation. It's all collaborative effort. And it has started working, I think. We do have that, like you said, how do we financially support those open source developers or project? But I think this crypto is actually creating new funding mechanism. That's why even as a foundation, we don't really try to create revenue like other normal foundations. So compared to the conventional way, so I try to learn a lot about open source project from the past, but it's actually, I thought what we are doing is something new. And so we have the power that the former open source project didn't have.
Yeah, absolutely. Oliver?
Yes, I agree. I think, well, obviously the reason why open source is important to crypto is, well, there is, at the beginning, there is this like security requirement. People grant a lot of trust to this kind of software, so we can't even think about closing the source code, you know. But I think there are more deep reason, which is I think open source can be somehow like the crash tests of crypto, because one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons so many people come to crypto is to say, oh, okay, maybe there we have a way to re-engineer economy, to re-engineer what a market is, and maybe it's not just about supply and demand and stuff like that, and maybe we can make our own rule. And I think open source and the question of open source sustainability is really interesting regarding that problem, because open source is like the worst problem almost, because it's like, okay, let's take something which by design is not a commodity, like it's made not to be one, and let's try to figure out if we can engineer something like a market or an economic sustainability process around that. And when you think about it, it can sound kind of crazy because, well, it's made not to be a community, by the way. So, so I think, well, if we manage to solve even partially the problem of open source to sustainability, it will also be some kind of a model for other problem crypto is trying to solve about how can we re-engineer the market, why not replicating the same mistakes or the same problems that the market enforces on the actual existing world.
That's very interesting. Taylor?
So I think one of the most interesting things about open source in general is that it requires a mind shift, and that mind shift is also one that's required to sort of buy into the crypto space or the blockchain space. And if you think and truly believe that what we're building and what we're doing in the cryptocurrency space or with the blockchain is valuable and is going to be more and more valuable over time, it's quite easy to also sort of buy into the mindset of open source. I think that one of the challenges that we're going to have is, you know, as this space grows and as it becomes more diverse and as you have bigger companies entering the space and as you have bigger companies or established corporations, you know, having them also buy into that mindset and valuing community and working together and openness and decentralization over their more traditional thought patterns is going to be immensely important. And it could be, like, I imagine it could be very easy for this space to be sucked into the more traditional way of doing things. And it's one of the reasons that I think it's incredibly important for us here today that are all pretty much of the same mindset and see the value of an open source to really focus on understanding where that value comes from, creating more value, helping each other out, researching, exploring, doing all of these things to really ensure that you know, as this space grows and becomes more established, we don't fall into those old dark patterns. So everyone who's really focused on creating products or creating companies or doing research in this space, you know, I applaud them, and I would encourage everyone to do more.
Absolutely. Jandan?
Yeah, so I definitely agree with the points about cryptocurrencies serving as a very interesting new tool that wasn't previously available to open source communities, and then the point about cryptocurrency space being an interesting test bed for the larger open source community. I think at the same time it's useful to be wary and tread with caution with something like this, because the reality is that funding isn't the one core issue at open source sustainability. So open source has a massive social coordination problem. Support comes in many ways, even outside of financial resources. There needs to be technical tools built out, social processes that are more mature. And I think it's great because everyone in this space, we kind of stand on the shoulders of giants in that we have learned so much from existing open source communities that have developed over the past few decades. But adding something like monetary incentives into the process is something not to be taken lightly. I think it's very powerful, but at the same time, it's kind of like a Pandora's box in that once you unleash that into a project, it kind of changes the social dynamics with that project a lot. So we should all think carefully about how we want to introduce it, but that shouldn't prevent us from experimenting at the same time, because now we have this interesting new tool available to us.
Yeah, actually about these new tools that we have, can you talk a little bit more about Open Collab and how you came out with this vision to make open source sustainable?
Sure. So it's funny because I wrote that paper almost 2 years ago now, and we've definitely learned so much through all the different things that people have worked on in the space. But to highlight my original motivation, it was thinking about what it actually means for an open source project to be sustainable. And I have to give credits to other people for borrowing these ideas from them. One example is Nadia Egbal, who researches open source communities, had this great paper called Roads and Bridges that discusses this particular topic, and she highlights two main factors that you should take into consideration for a sustainable open source project, namely health and support, where health you can measure as how adequately and actively developers actually cater to the demands and needs of the users. And then support is both financial resources and technical resources. So you can think of technical resources as what does GitHub give you that helps you maintain a project? If you have no tools available, it doesn't matter if you have all the funding available. If the tools aren't available for you to manage the project, you're kind of screwed anyway. So trying to identify that, and then realizing that one of the hardest jobs as someone that works in open source is being a maintainer, and you have extremely scarce attention. I was curious if there could be a potential funding model that also helps with this problem and helps allocate attention across the various things that an open source maintainer would have to do, and give them an actual incentive to actually stick around and keep working on the project and help with issue triage, onboarding new users. So the paper at a high level just described I guess something that's popular now, like curation markets, is a variant of a curation market, except its goal is to use tokens as a way to allocate attention towards particular GitHub issues that are on a project sprint board. A lot of these ideas are being taken further than what was originally presented there by teams like Pando and other teams in the space. But the general idea was using a scarce resource like a token in order to allocate attention across these various issues, and then have an inflation funding model that can be split across the maintainer that actually does the code review in addition to the contributor itself. The idea behind that was that stuff like bounties are great, but they ultimately focus on contributors, and contributors are really important, but they're not the only player in this open source project. Ultimately, once you have a flood of contributors, your bottleneck ends up being maintainers, and that's not exactly always the most glorious position, because you don't actually get to work on a lot of interesting technical problems. In a lot of cases, you have to do management, you have to deal with like onboarding, and that's not exactly the most glamorous role in a lot of people's eyes. So it's important not to have that bottleneck. So the intention behind the mechanism of splitting inflationary rewards between maintainers and contributors was an attempt to start taking steps toward that.
Yeah, I think that model is mind-blowing, and I cannot like wait until we have models that actually like work like that, and we have stuff like Panda out there, and people actually use that stuff. Backing it up to today, I have like a very concrete question for Taylor. So you guys are basically like powering like a lot of users, but not only in the technical side, but also like the support side. You get a lot of support requests, and you basically are like the ones that kind of help everyone hand by hand to like get into crypto. Do you get a lot of open source contributions?
So it varies. We have, right now at this moment, we have very specific things in our project that get a lot of contributors. And it used to be quite different. So I'm going to start from the beginning. One of the most remarkable things that I have ever experienced and really kind of like blew my mind was back when I wanted to have the site translated into like a whole variety of languages. And so I made like these files. They were JSON files. They had every single string in English in the thing. And I basically reached out to like the community, which on that time was like pretty much Reddit, right? Like all of Ethereum was on Reddit. And I said, hey, we want to get this translated. If you know another language besides English, help us out. And we had very specific instructions on how to go into these files. Don't delete the quotations, don't edit the colons, like just edit the strings. And we basically empowered people from around the globe to translate our entire website at no cost to us. And then what was actually more interesting, which is a little bit of what you were making a point about, is that then we had some languages that were maybe half translated or weren't translated, and I started, going out and trying to find people to translate these. And I figured, hey, if I put a bounty on it, if I had some monetary incentive to it, then they'll be translated like that. The reality is that the second we added that monetary value, we actually had less interest in translating those files because the motivations and the incentives had changed, rather than, hey, I have this skill or I have this talent or I have this whatever, and I can contribute to this product and I can make the product better and therefore the entire Ethereum ecosystem better. Now it was, okay, is this worth, say, $100 or $500 or $1,000 or $50 or whatever it was? And we found that the interest just like fell off the map. It was really interesting. And I think the reason is that one of the most powerful things about open source is that you have the ability to empower people to come together to make your product or the ecosystem or whatever it is better and stronger. And people are enticed by that. They find an immense amount of satisfaction from doing that. And so now, today, what we do is we have a balance. For some of the more, we can call them like grunt work, right? Those tedious tasks that no one really wants to do, but they're great entry-level tasks. They don't have immense effect on our code base, but someone has to do them. We love putting bounties on those because the reality is, it's not likely that people are going to get satisfaction out of doing those tasks, so that monetary incentive helps. But the biggest sort of features that we find contributors for are twofold. One is if someone who personally uses our product has an issue with something, say an error message isn't clear enough, say the confirmation modal could be more clear, or they want to make something bigger or whatever, people who use our product will go in and like make that little change. And we love those. And then the other one is people that typically on other Ethereum-based networks, so like Rootstock's one example of this, they have some specific feature for that network that they want to enable on our product. So for example, Rootstock recently added their name service so that their names are now resolved. And that's not something that we would ever do because we're just not in that community, we don't know anything about it, etc. But we're able to work with that team in order to get that feature on, and then everyone benefits. Another great example is Chronologic and their scheduling feature, so you can like send a transaction at a later time. Chronologic was solely responsible for getting that feature actually in. We worked with them to help them understand the code base and things like that, but they were really leading the front on that. And one of the things that I'm thinking about for this coming year is how do we continue to incentivize both teams who may have a feature or a protocol or something that they want in our product, but also just general people who want to make our product better. How do you call attention to the things that need the most help with? How do you incentivize, and not necessarily financially, but incentivize people to take the action and feel empowered? And I don't have a lot of great answers for those, but we're definitely going to be experimenting. And if anyone out there has any great experiences, I'd love to hear them.
Awesome. Yeah, I think you touch upon a very interesting point, which is the fact that sometimes if you have open source contributors and you put bounties to it, it kind of removes a little bit of the essence of like that community feeling, and you may get some like mercenaries and not use like community people. So how do we get that balance, Olivier? How do you think that with something like Pando, you can actually create, when Pando is on mainnet, which is going to be very soon, you can actually incentivize your community to participate while still getting the core essence of your community?
Yeah, actually that's a really tricky question, I guess, but a really important one, how you like balance the feeling of belonging to the project and the economic incentive, which is also important but can kill the first one. The way we deal with that in Pando is that so basically this whole contribution tracking system relies on a token that you are granted with when you push a contribution, it's accepted. But obviously that token is not a currency token. You know, it's like an untransferable token. It's just a way to acknowledge that you have been a part of this project up to that amount or that amount, and so on. So it was kind of important for us because when we designed the whole system, we're like, okay, we precisely don't want that any kind of contribution become just pushed or driven by an economic incentives, because it will kill the whole open source ethos. So the idea on Pando, at least, like, okay, we do acknowledge this kind of contribution thanks to an untransferable token, and somehow, if there is an income coming, that it's up to all the contributors to decide how do we share this earning, how do we share this income, but it's up to the governance system to decide of how this sharing takes place. So basically, it does not prevent you to contribute just for the pleasure of contributing, just to enhance the product, or just because you want to feel like you're a part of this and you have just brought your little piece to the whole puzzle. And I think this is also important because in such a system, we can expect that most of the contributors are gonna have like such a small amount of authorship into the whole repo that even though there is an economic income at some point, it's gonna be like super symbolic, you know, because it's not how you're gonna get a living out of your work. So it's mostly to say, okay, great guys, you've been contributing, so it's acknowledged right now, it's written on this blockchain, it's never gonna get out, it's always gonna be there, and well, maybe you're gonna gain like 10 cents at some point, but obviously that's not the whole point about what you've done. So
That's amazing. I have another quick question for you. When mainnet?
okay. Well, first of all, we expect to have like the Rinkaby release in a couple of weeks, probably during February. Like people are going to be able to play with Pando and Rinkaby without having to like clone the whole code base and deploy on the local chain and all. And then we would like to have a mainnet release for this summer if everything goes well. So.
Amazing. Looking forward to that. You heard it here first. So now let's switch back to Ethereum, because that's what we're all using, and without it we'll be pretty much, well, not in a very good position. So we need to make sure that Ethereum is properly funded. And so I'm very curious to know, Aya, what are the steps that you are taking and the Ethereum Foundation is taking to fund Ethereum's development right now?
So we do have grant program. As you know, we've been doing that more aggressively starting last year since I joined. It is very important for us to basically, again, like our role has shifted, and then now the Ethereum ecosystem is very big. We need to empower others to be able to build this. And then it's also not just because of the size of the ecosystem, that the goal is to make, this is open source. We always think about the time when we don't exist anymore, or I don't, like after I die or after I've done so we do think about this, like we do talk about this very, very often, or like even the question like how long the foundation should exist, or so that's why I use this term, like we intend to grow small, meaning that like I'm not saying like it's important for us to disappear. It's more like it's important for us to actually let others shine and empower them. And so even the grant program itself, we did give like more than 20 million amount of fund last year, but it shouldn't be just EF to fund those program. And so even the decision making of grant program has been we're trying to involve other community members to make the decision who to fund, but also we're trying to encourage others to join us to fund programs, fund projects, and we do think it's important to increasingly encourage others to join us. Like there are already happening there. It's already happening there. There are some DAO funding mechanisms that the other members are trying to build, which is great. We're happy to work with them or let them fund any project because we at the end of the day, EF doesn't own Ethereum. It's not ours. It's everyone's. So anyone can participate supporting these projects, and the more funding systems exist, I think the more sustainable our ecosystem is. And so that's our stance. So this year, that's something that the focus that we're trying to achieve.
That's great to hear. Yeah, I mean, totally. Ethereum is everyone. And I think one question that, and one topic that we've been hearing here a lot is like protocol inflation, or in general protocol pools that can be created at like the layer 1 to basically mint new tokens to have this into a DAO that then can basically distribute this as the community decides to fund different teams. Is that something you would like to see in Ethereum in the next, well, soon?
Sorry. Sorry, I was thinking of
like in terms of protocol development and funding, would you like to see Ethereum having some kind of like native way of funding itself in protocol development with like maybe inflation, like 1 ETH per block going to a DAO that then can be distributed?
Yeah, that's a very actually big interesting question that I don't think we can finish in. I don't know. Oh, it's already time is up. I'd love to discuss this because at the end of the day, it shouldn't be our decision. I do think the more I think about this, or I personally think about this, that's something that we should all consider. But how we do it's not an easy question to answer. And I like to have this discussion to be, like more open to everyone because I think it's very important.
Absolutely. Yeah, so let's actually do that. Let's actually open it up to some questions. I think we have like 3 minutes, so maybe a couple ones. But if I find the mic, I can throw it away. Oh, there he is. So yeah, any questions for the audience, for our awesome panelists? If not, we'll just keep talking for another couple of minutes, asking random questions.
Oh, now we can see.
No questions. Oh my God, that means we explain ourselves so well. I think, yeah, I think we're on time. But this was really amazing. I think we got this like kind of oversight of from the short term, like like my crypto, the EF. What are you guys doing right now to make open source sustainable and make your own, of course, like my crypto and Ethereum sustainable, and also John and Olivier with like the future, how it looks like, how we can have these generalized kind of protocols and models, so we can apply them to every open source project and make it sustainable, which I think will be amazing. So this is the future that I personally want to live in. So thanks a lot for joining us, to all our panelists, and thanks to the audience for being here.
Must be, but when did you learn to do that? He's done it again. It's some new technique. Must be, but when did you learn to do that?
Ladies and gentlemen, our program will begin in 5 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our program is about to begin.
All right. Welcome back. We are slowly straggling in from the coffee room. Do have a couple of announcements, which apparently most people won't hear, but hey, that's their loss, I guess. I will make a little bit of noise, and maybe people will start coming over. Clement from Claros is, there's going to be some breakout rooms downstairs at registration, and at 2, Kendall's Bank with the ramp guys, and at 3:30 with Clement from Claros as well. All right, well, let's have Brett come on stage and tell us about AraCon 1 in 2019. Welcome, Brett.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming here and showing up. I appreciate that you've come out a little bit early from coffee break. I know we're a little bit behind. So this talk, I couldn't help but Photoshop this image. This is kind of how I think I was feeling this weekend after AGP 1. I hope some other teams, some other proposals felt like this too, coming after this weekend, especially Altark, who were just made it. And you guys probably feel like $1 million, so I don't want to take away from that. But essentially, yeah, this was huge news over the weekend that we were all in the team watching very carefully with scripts, essentially looking at the votes coming in, trickling in on Etherscan. And I want to just take a look at these results and really say thank you to everyone who voted with enormous support. We got over 7.5% of the voting of the token population on the AraCon network token to vote for AraCon 1 to support us as an independent team supporting the AraCon project going forward. And before we continue, I do notice that there is a slight 3%, and so I'm curious if anybody here actually voted no. Did anyone vote no? Don't be afraid. No? Okay, all right, that's good. I hope, this talk, you probably read the Flock proposal, and so there's probably nothing you're going to gain from it, but I hope you find this entertaining otherwise. And for the people who did vote no and aren't just too afraid to say, I hope I change your mind. So to look at 2019, I think we need to look back at 2018. We've had a lot of talks about what last year was for us. And it's kind of interesting because I follow up yesterday's acts, and we didn't really coordinate a lot in terms of how we made our presentation. So it's really interesting that we've come in a distributed, decentralized kind of way for consensus about thinking about the themes and the topics in the same way for AraCon 1. Jorge said last year was the year of infrastructure, and I want to say that that's true not just for the technology that we've built, but also for the governance that we've managed to build and the foundations that we have for the AraCon project in 2018. So this all started, I'd say, in February 14th, about a year ago. This was Lewis's love letter to the AraCon project and to decentralized organizations, right? He, in this blog post, we're going to be following a series of blog posts. Lewis basically laid out what it means for a nonprofit foundation to look over and guide a decentralized project and to make it successful. What assets does it need? What controls does it need? How does it grow from there, and how does it continue to evolve? Right, so after a couple periods of intense work, we come to May, and I promise you this is really intense work. I can attest to that myself. We launched 0.5 on Rinkeby after many weeks of trying to ship repeatedly, and we finally did that in the end of April, and it allowed us a little bit of time to think about what decentralizing the project would mean as we continued into 2018. So the second blog post talks about the minimum viable foundation, and it's the natural step of how the AraCon Foundation, or the association now, will change over time. What 0.1 meant, what 1.0 means, what 2.0 means, what 3.0 means, and ultimately what it means to dissolve, right? And so right now we're at the association, we're at 1.0. We've come from an entirely centralized team into one that has a foundation, or has a nonprofit, has an umbrella over independent teams working on top of it. It owns assets, but it's going to continue to decentralize over the time. It's going to give up those assets, give control to them, to the network. And that's where we started thinking about the AraCon manifesto. once we started thinking about what it means for the network to own assets, to have a life of its own, we needed to say, what does this network represent? And so we had a very, very long workshop on this as a team, and we came out with a number of principles that will guide us into the future as a project, not just as a team, as a movement, as a project. And so following this, we came to the conclusion that we needed to announce AraCon 1. And May 14th, I believe, 16th, AraCon 1 was announced to the world with this beautiful logo by Adri, who designed the original AraCon project logo. And so this was the first step where we said the AraCon Foundation, or now association, is going to start giving away some of, or not really giving away, but kind of delegating some of its priorities into independent teams, and which AraCon 1 is the founding team that has become independent now from the project. We then move on to talking about more teams, to saying, what does it mean for more than just AraCon 1 to work on this project? What does it mean for another team like the DAC, Altarc, or another FLOT team to come into the scene and to be an independent team under the umbrella of the network, and how do we get that going? This also includes Nest, because we see a lot of Nest grantees as independent teams as well, and they're working on really, really cool things that are just totally blowing us away this weekend, and I want to give them props as well for that. So then we go over to August, where the DAC was announced, and it got kicked off. We were in collaboration with Giveth for a few months before this, but this is when it really kickstarted, and this was a huge step, because it meant we went from 0 to 1 to 2 in the step of about 4 months. And this is really, really incredible, because as any technologist will tell you, going from 0 to 1 is really difficult. Going from 1 to 2 is, again, difficult. Going from 2 to 10 to n is a lot less challenging, because you already have the foundations, you already have the established protocols that you already need when you go from 1 to 2. And so this was a really exciting experiment that we had with the DAC. And unfortunately, they did not get into the AGP round in this time, but we hope that they'll come back again. And I'm honestly looking forward to seeing them again in the next AGP or another AGP down the line. And so going off of this, we had done some experiments, and we decided that at the end of October, it was time for us to say we're opening up registrations for new teams. We want new FLOT teams. We've gone through this process. We found out what works. We found out what doesn't work. And we want more teams to start applying so that we can go from 2 to 3 to 4 to 10 to however many we need in the future to make AraCon as a project successful and to maintain its sustainability. And then finally, we had the first AGP vote, which ultimately ratified the process that we just had in January about how we make decisions as a project, and taking the decision making away from just us as a team into more of a decentralized, community-based organization. And so with this, I think we've laid out a lot of the foundations for what we're going to look at in 2019 and what it means for AraCon 1 as a FLOT team inside this infrastructure. Right now that we have this infrastructure, we have to use it, and we will only be successful if we use it properly, and we take advantage of its strengths. Right, so for us, this means AraCon 1 abides by all the same rules as any other FLOT team, right? You see here, this is in the AraCon/Flock GitHub repo. This was I believe this was the first pull request merged, yeah. So we are the same as any other FLOT team. We request to the association. You'll see here, it wasn't one of the developers, it wasn't Louis, it wasn't Jorge, but it was Stefano, who is the executive director, that merged and reviewed this pull request. Right? This is already getting to a level of independence. Although it's just on GitHub, it already is establishing that protocol. We ask here, we say the team is the founding team. We intend to work on the project in the future. I mean, I hope that's the case. But we also ask for funding. We ask for this amount of money to cover us over the next year. And then we'll see, I hope some of you have read the full proposal, but it also outlines a number of different things inside what it means to be a FLOT team. And I want to say, before we get into those requirements, that this has always been the plan from version 0 of the network. I took these graphics from the original white paper that was released in April of 2017, and in this diagram of the network ecosystem, of the value transfers that happen inside this ecosystem, we see here we have the AraCon network having proposals from the A&T voters that then require services. They need things to be built. They need a decentralized court, etc. What does that mean? Well, that means as a service provider, AraCon 1 fits in really well here. In this other graphic, we see the deployment of the AraCon network. How will the association, or how will the network ultimately be deployed from the association, right? And so AraCon 1 again comes in really handily right here, where we slot in as the service provider that will deploy, build the AraCon network, submit the AraCon network address to the multisig, and then start the process of the association whittling itself down and giving more and more control into the network. But as a team, what does this really mean, right? So I alluded to this before. As a FLOT team, we submit requirements to the association. We get nothing for free from the association, right? As part of our FLOT proposal, we say, we want access to the blog. We want access to the GitHub repos. We need these tools to proactively work and to be productive. But we don't get these for free. We need to request them, right? We request for this funding. And this is a really good opportunity for us to stay hungry, because we get these on 1-year lifespans, and that means we have to be accountable. We have to be repeatable with the success. We get this funding, and then we say, these are our promises. This is what we want to deliver. Next year, to the association, we say, this is what we've done in the last year. This is what will do again in 2020. And then we leave it up to the token holders to ultimately decide whether or not they want to re-grant us these permissions. And on a different level, it really changes the way we look at how we interact with the association, right? Because the association ultimately is the protector of the AraCon network right now. The network is in a seedling phase. It's starting to grow. We've planted the seeds, but it can't survive in the wild in an adverse environment. And so the AraCon project, the association, is protecting it. It has fiduciary duties. It has stewardship over this child that we've started to brew, I guess. I can't really make a good analogy. But what AraCon 1 then means is we have a level of indirection from this. We are accountable to the association. We provide services to the association, who ultimately is stewarding the network. And this means that for proposals, I really have to reiterate this. If you ask Luis or Jorge or one of us at this conference or any time, if you propose to AraCon 1, the result you get is an AraCon 1 result. It is not the association. It is not the project. But what can happen is, if you propose through an official method like the AGPs, if you want to make a proclamation, if you want us to say support a different fork, a different network, do something for the community, etc., you go through an official process, you talk to the association, and then the association, if they ratify it, they say, all right, we may be able to do this, or we may shuttle it into a service provider, into a FLOC team like AraCon 1, who can then ultimately interact with the real world and enact these actions, right? But with all of this said, it doesn't mean that as FLOC teams, we're completely independent from each other, right? We still want to have these network effects of having teams working on the same thing, but be independent. And we go back not just up to the association, but to other teams through a lot of these shared resources that we have. So we all have shared resources on GitHub, but we also have the project blog. We've organized all dev calls very similarly to the Ethereum all dev calls, where we come together. Now it's about 20, 25, 30 people each every 2 weeks for these all dev calls, where we talk about issues that we submit ahead of time. And then there's also roadmap planning for 6 months of each coming 2 quarters, I guess. FLOC teams propose what they'll be working on, and then we kind of ratify this as a project roadmap so that token holders kind of know what they're getting through each FLOC team at 6-month intervals. Before we get into more of the product things, I know I've talked a lot about governance, and I'm really excited to get into the product things. I want to take us to a small demo based on what Lewis announced yesterday. So backstage, if we could go to the demo. Awesome. All right, so I actually had this on up on GitHub, knowing the network. So the AraCon desktop is something we're really, really excited to announce. I wanted to kind of show it off on stage now I've given it a chance. So I'm going to push the publish button. So now it's available for everybody. I want to kick it off. Hopefully IPFS is happy with us. All right, so we'll come on. We'll see mostly the same things, but you'll notice that the app right now has every feature that we currently have in the web app. If you want it to be on mobile, we can do that. We can make it mobile. If you want to run 2 versions, I found out this nice trick. Two DAOs side by side, you can do that. I was going to demo a Rinkeby Ether transfer based on one finance organization transferring to another one. But I didn't get that set up in time, and Rinkeby with IPFS, the network in this internet, has been a little bit difficult, so we won't get to that. But it is available now for everybody to try, and I hope you play with it. Please let us know. It is a pre-release. We're just getting this out, but we're really, really excited to see people run this. It runs an IPFS node locally, so you don't have to rely on the network once you fetched it once. In the future, we may also make it more decentralized by providing a light node, things like that, as research goes. Backstage, if we could go to the slides. I'll just keep showing this off in the meantime. Ooh. All right. So for 2019, I wanted to group what we're doing as part of a Flock proposal in kind of 4 sets of challenges that we currently have with the product. The first one is voter turnout. We talked a lot about making sustainable, scalable voting this past couple of days. We saw with AGP1, there was only about 2.5% in the turnout for token holders, which is incredible because it's now the process we use to govern the entire project, and only 2.5 people showed up for this, right? It's kind of amazing that 97.5% didn't bother to care, but probably a lot of the reason was they had A&T and cold wallets and things like that. They found the gas price too expensive. They didn't want to vote, and so the first thing we have on our roadmap in 2019 is to think about vote relaying, and I really love this animation. So if we look at the world right now as it is, what we're trying to do is kind of reconfigure it in many ways. We're trying to rebuild voting infrastructure to be scalable, digital voting infrastructure, decentralized voting infrastructure to be sustainable and scalable. We want to have nodes, relayers, take votes, batch them, send them out into the network so that each person doesn't have to have a transaction be sent, and as well relayers can subsidize every vote that comes in rather than each individual having to pay that themselves. So that's a really great use case for project governance like our project, where the association can decide to subsidize voting for AGP voting so that you don't have to deal with this UX of paying money every time you want to make a decision. The other one is voting delegation, and this is something we just started looking into, but it's something we hope to propose in a future AGP and then to roll out as maybe the 3rd or 4th AGP in this year, where we have very simple voting delegation of just one address to one address. Unfortunately, delegation chains are very difficult given the environment, the execution environment we get with Ethereum. If you have any ideas on better data structures, this is an open advertisement to come talk to us. But up till now, we've had a really difficult time getting voting delegation past a couple of delegations, and we said one is probably enough just to try this out and to get a lot better turnout. The next one is a lot of UX challenges we have with our product. So up until yesterday, this is what the token manager looked like. And if you look at it, it's not very friendly, right? My girlfriend, I was showing this to my girlfriend yesterday, and she was like, what are these strings? Like, who is that? How do I know what's going on, right? She took a look at the finance app and she's like, who are these transfers to? What does it all mean? I was like, okay, first you have to understand each of these could be a person, it could not be, but they're essentially an address that we send money to, right? And so this is really difficult to get right, and this is a big problem with identity. So we have a few research topics as well, but we really want to start integrating ENS into our application to start providing membership based on your ENS subdomain, and then start resolving that inside the UI so that we can not just look at addresses and not just ENS name, but also perhaps a local address book that you start typing into so that you can configure the app to look how you want it based on your local knowledge. The second one is expressive permissions. So with AraCon OS right now, if you've looked into it, I highly recommend looking at the ACL. It's a beast, but it provides incredible functionality. This is one of them. The ability to have permissioning on AraCon OS is very rich. We essentially have a mini script virtual machine running inside our ACL, where you can actually start inputting inputs to say, I want to evaluate my permission based on some parameters that I get from a function. But this is impossible for anybody to use. And nobody, to my knowledge, has used it. So what we want to do is make a UI, or start thinking about and start making a nice UI for users to make this really easy. The next one is mobile. I think we've already looked at that. Jorge's given a demo. We won't go into that too much. And then the third one, this is perhaps one of the most important, is broadening our sandbox. So we have 3 applications right now on AraCon. We want to make, of course, more, but through the last year, we've also found that a lot of teams, a lot of projects have come to us and said, what we get isn't enough. We don't get enough functionality. The SDK that Arthur introduced yesterday has a bunch of limitations, and it's kind of limiting what the implementation space can be as compared to someone's imagination. And so it's really funny. I have this graphic here, right? So there's 3 little things we get. We get voting, finance, and the token manager, and it's in a box. But what we want to start doing is allow people from the UI to install applications. The first version of this will be upgrading existing apps, but then the next one will be adding apps and then allowing anybody from the UI to find an application and to install it and test it. The next one is a payroll application that we're very, very excited to start rolling out internally for now, but this is something that a team called Protofire has done an incredible job at, and it looks literally amazing. This is essentially self-sovereign payroll. You get calculated based on the block. You can withdraw at any time. I'm so excited to use this. And that's the other side of it, where a team can look at its payroll over the last year. It has a nice graph for how much people have been getting paid. And that is real. We just are not rolling that out because of audits and other technical complications at this current time. The third and final thing that we're working on is something called the agent app. And right now we saw in the sandbox clip art that the walls were limited, right? If we want an organization to talk to another organization, it's very difficult. You basically have to send raw transactions or like do something funny with your voting app. What we want to do, let's say AraCon 1 has some ANT that they want to send over to the DC. Maybe they want to stake it. Maybe they want to interact with another protocol like 0x or Uniswap. We get them the agent app. The agent app has an external function that allows you to execute arbitrary transactions. That agent app will be the one sending it to the DC or different or interacting with a different protocol. If they want to do the same thing, they install and instantiate an agent app, and they can do the same thing back. So this will really open up organizations to the world. Right now we have these organizations kind of limited one by one, but to be really useful, they have to start interacting with the outside world. And as a culmination of that, we've always said from day one that the AraCon network is going to be this umbrella of organizations. And I love this part from the video because it really puts us into reality, right? The first part is we need organizations for the AraCon network to exist. And then the second part is the world's first digital jurisdiction. All right, so how do we as a community keep AraCon 1 accountable? Well, the first part is we have a public roadmap, or we will have a public roadmap. This is something internal for now, and it looks really pretty, and we'll try and make this public and as pretty. We have GitHub projects that we translate these roadmaps into so that anybody can go on AraCon/projects and take a look at where our high-level actions for 2019 are happening through the roadmap. The last part is the dashboard, and this is something we're really excited to be using. We have on-chain statistics of what is actually happening with AraCon organizations. And so here you can see we have a bunch of ANT, we have a bunch of ETH. Unfortunately, we just did payroll, so our DAI is a little bit low. But you can start seeing, or we can start seeing, we want to make this public soon, that all of these graphs community members have access to, and that they can kind of tell how the network is going, what organizations are being used, how many active ones are there being used. And so we can really start to see what the network effects will be when organizations start interacting with each other. And all of this is, of course, coming soon. We can't promise dates. We can only promise soon. So I want to end by having a small advertisement. If you're interested by any of this, we are hiring. So please look at that link and talk to us at this conference. And I want to give a special celebration to Bingen and Joni, who have so yesterday was Joni and Bingen's 1-year anniversary at AraCon 1, and we're really happy to have them. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Brett. Up next, we have Ryan Zur. He's going to be talking about the state of Web3 and crypto governance on Polkadot. Take it away, Ryan.
Cheers. Hey, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'd like to actually extend a big thank you to the AraCon team, Jorge and Luis and Stefano, and their entire team, not only for putting on this event, but for everything they do to push crypto governance forward in our community. The work that they're doing is fantastic. I'm excited to be a part of their community and really excited to watch this project grow and evolve, and also work with them more closely with Polkadot and Web3. So just to talk a little bit about Web3, what is Web3 to start? It is Gavin Wood's vision for a serverless, decentralized internet, where users have greater control over their privacy, their sovereign identity, their financial accounts, and ultimately their own destiny. Where decentralized networks leverage trustless incentivization through sound crypto economic design. And when we talk about crypto economic design, we also talk about crypto governance design. Why do we call it Web3? So we went through the era of Web 1, which is sort of the 90s, static websites, really no monetization except for advertising, terrible UX, UI. Then we evolved into Web 2. This was social, mobile. Websites became more interactive, and users could create content and connect with one another. What monetization, though, continued to be basically an advertising model, even though it evolved a little bit into the, what we call surveillance capitalism. Privacy issues remain. We've had this massive consolidation of power into essentially a cartel, and now we're in the dawn of a new era of Web3, where decentralized applications built and operating on WASM virtual machines. Monetization is baked directly in at the protocol layer, and that's really interesting. What I often say is that Web 2 got user growth right really easily, but had difficulty with monetization. Web3 has struggled with user growth, but got monetization right sort of natively. And very fortunately in Web3, we see a better decentralization and distribution of power and wealth. The Gini coefficient, even in current crypto networks, is much lower than what we see in Web 2 markets and society at large. So we know that we're on the right path. So why does this matter? Why does Web 3 matter? It matters because Web 2 has failed us. A small cartel of companies control more than 80% of cloud storage, more than 90% of cloud compute. Even smaller cartel of companies control almost all of your data. They commercialize it as they see fit, and you are essentially the product of Web 2. I often say that we shouldn't get the use of Twitter or Facebook for free. We should be paid to use Facebook and Twitter and share our information with them. And this is the type of thing that Web3 technologies enable. And with Web3 technologies and better control of our data so that we can monetize our own data to whoever we see fit, we can get into more interesting models that could actually end up looking like universal basic income. If Facebook had to pay every one of its users, we could have actually a first best attempt at universal basic income. So, Web 2 models, I think we can all agree, are monetization models, that is, are unethical, and frankly, we deserve better. So enter Web 3. And just to talk a little bit about our cultures and our values, what we want to create are borderless public goods commons, where there's representation and proper governance across these commons. And we believe that transparent, enforceable governance is a noble pursuit in and of itself. And while we don't have the perfect governance model for every constituent or every community, pursuing this matters, and we should continue to do so. We also need safe spaces for experimentation, for pushing this, pushing the vanguard forward and continuing to innovate and experiment with crypto economic models, with crypto governance models that are upgradable and can be adjusted over time, because we don't have all the answers. And we believe that sound crypto economic design that creates an appropriate Nash equilibrium between networks can accelerate network effects. And so we're excited about the convergence of these technologies. So enter Polkadot. And why am I so excited about Polkadot? Why are a lot of people here so excited about Polkadot? First, it's incredibly technically ambitious. Using parallelized security, we can allow for arbitrary smart contract messaging across chains. This allows, say, an Ethereum smart contract to talk with a Tezos smart contract, or a Ethereum smart contract to potentially make a transaction on the Zcash blockchain. This is very interesting and can obviously open up new use cases and new applications for many people. Polkadot leverages a novel hybrid consensus mechanism, offers increased security, and a novel crypto economic design between the different actors on this network. But something that we're all excited about here this week is a crypto governance model, and I'll get into this a little bit further. But then myself, as an investor in the space for a long time, a big signal that I've taken from this project is just the team. The V1 is being built out by the Parity team, and this is an extraordinary team of some of the leading minds in the space, again, pushing the vanguard forward. And I'm just incredibly humbled to see just how much they ship, and not only ship, but ship on time. So just a quick overview of Polkadot. So you've got a relay chain, which is essentially the base chain, and then other blockchains can connect into that base chain, either being built as a native parachain, so they can build using the substrate framework and connect into Polkadot natively, or if there's some legacy issues there, they can have a bridge. And that's the case for Ethereum that's building a bridge. It's the case for Zcash that's building a bridge. But we're here mostly to talk about crypto governance this week. And this is a topic of particular interest, and I think one of the most exciting areas in our industry. And so what's cool and new about Polkadot's crypto governance? So we have referendums. I'll get into something called adaptive quorum biasing, which is a really interesting innovation that solves part of the problem of low turnout. There's a council that allows for quick decisions on certain matters and just sort of gatekeeping other matters and ensuring that people aren't attacking the network with referendum for frivolous items. There's something called lock voting, which we'll talk about a little bit. That council goes through its own approval voting, and then part of the block reward of Polkadot goes into a treasury DAO that will not only incentivize validators, but will also incentivize other key constituents in the network, like protocol layer developers, application developers, and even users. And we'll talk a little bit about delayed autonomous enactment, which is a nice security mechanism that I think a lot of governance models should implement. So we have a council that goes through approval voting. This council switches out one member per month over time. If the council proposes a vote either unanimously or by supermajority, it gets tabled faster, and then the adaptive quorum biasing changes. However, any coin holder can also table a vote at any time. They stake, and then other people can stake with them to get that vote or that measure voted on more quickly. So think of it kind of like Reddit upvote, downvote style in order for motions to be actually tabled for a vote. And and then once things come together for a vote, it essentially sits with the coin holders. However, you can add more weight to your votes, to your tokens. It's not just one token, one vote. What we have is what we call time lock voting. So a quick example here, Alice, Bob, and Charlie. Alice and Charlie vote no on the first vote, and they lock their tokens. Alice has 1, Charlie has 4. They lock their tokens for 8 weeks and 2 weeks respectively. Bob, who has a lot of tokens and believes in the issue at hand, votes yes, and he locks for 6 weeks respectively. Now, because he has more dots and locks for a longer period of time, Bob wins the vote, but then his tokens are locked over that period of time, and Alice and Charlie have an opportunity to leave the system if they don't believe in what's happening. If they think that this is a catastrophic event, they may decide to leave the system. They can do so. Bob can't. So a second example, Alice and Charlie actually believe really strongly in the matter at hand. Bob not so much, so he only agrees to lock for 4 weeks. In this case, the no wins the vote, and so Alice and Charlie are locked in. They can't do anything with their tokens, and Bob has the opportunity to opt out. This is a way around the Plutarch's argument, where not only does it matter how many tokens you have, but it matters how much you're willing to stake yourself to be in this system should what you want go through. And then another thing, which is actually a really interesting innovation, I think Gavin Wood will be remembered for many innovations in this space, but adaptive quorum biasing will certainly probably be one of them. And so what happens here is if the council proposes a vote, then and there's low turnout, then you need a lot of no's over the yeses in order to reject the vote. If a regular coin holder proposes a vote, you need more yeses over those no's if there's low turnout. As you get higher turnout, it tends towards 50 plus 1% anyways. But in the cases of low turnout, what will matter is, has it gone through the council or has it just been proposed by any coin holder? And this is just a mechanism of security to ensure that we don't have a random proposal proposed by a coin holder and then voted at some obscure time, and with low turnout passes and then goes through, and that's catastrophic. We use the council along with this dynamic quorum biasing in order to ensure security in the governance mechanism. And this, again, I think is a really important innovation in crypto governance. So roadmap for Polkadot. Again, as I mentioned, one of the most impressive things about this project and the reason why I decided to focus my time here is this team and their ability to execute. And so Polkadot will ship this year, later on in 2019. We're incredibly excited about it. We're seeing an incredible wave of talented entrepreneurs and projects migrating to the Polkadot network and seeing the solutions that Polkadot offers, whether it's from security or novel crypto economic design or interesting governance, and the fact that it'll evolve in an appropriate fashion. So this is very exciting, and we're, we couldn't be happier about the progress. So some cool things that are being built in the Polkadot ecosystem already. There's lots of different projects, but I'll just highlight a few with the time that I have left. One is Substrate. So this is a development framework that allows you to easily spin up a blockchain and spin up decentralized applications and be able to deploy them on Polkadot. It comes native with a light client. It is architected using a WASM or a WASM VM. Also uses libp2p. There's a Rust as the primary implementation. However, we're going to see other implementations in JavaScript, in Go, in C++ over time. And what this does is it abstracts away the low layer part of building up a decentralized application or even your own blockchain. And you can focus just on your app and your user experience, and that low layer part of spinning up a blockchain is basically done for you. This is a blockchain in a box, essentially. At the Web3 Summit last year, Gavin spun up a blockchain and deployed an app in about 15 minutes. This was something that took years before, and now a Substrate is relatively trivial. So a really important innovation for our space. There's lots of documentation and recipes, and so I suggest you go and take a look at Substrate. Even a relatively non-technical, higher abstraction developer can spin something up here. And another project which I'm particularly interested in is Edgeware. So Edgeware is an experimental chain that has real financial incentives, and the idea is that we test and evolve governance mechanisms. It will also have a DAO treasury, so about approximately half the block reward will go into this DAO, and the DAO will recursively fund development and evolution of the ecosystem. So this is app developers and further protocol layer development, and even the wider community evangelism usage, so on and so forth. We are also using a novel funding mechanism. Actually, it's not a funding mechanism. All the tokens are going to be distributed to the community via lock and drop. So you'll be able to lock your ETH or your DOTs. You'll get your ETH or DOTs back over some period of time, so you can lock for 3, 6, or 12 months. And then you'll get edge tokens, which give you the rights to vote towards the distribution of the DAO and participate in the network. Again, because of the experimental nature of this, you will definitely get your tokens back that you lock, but it allows you in a very low risk manner to participate in this network. Edgeware is really interesting, and I'm sure the AraCon guys are also seeing this, but with Edgeware, I've been seeing this great migration of political science academics and people from the traditional governance world getting excited about crypto for the first time, because they see this as an opportunity for them to move their field of academic study or business forward, and it's a lot of fun. So keep an eye out for Edgeware. Other collabs, again, we've seen this great migration of teams getting excited in the space. AraCon announcing yesterday. Zcash and Ethereum both intending to build bridges, but there are other projects like Edgeware, like Blink, which is a DAG, a number of tools like Polkascan and Polkasource, Clover, which is a great, really well done IDE, and we're just incredibly grateful and very excited with all the partnerships and community members that we've been able to develop. So if you want to join the community, it's a vibrant global community. We have been all over the world in the last 12 months doing meetups and connecting with members of our community, and we'll be all over the world over the next 12 months. So please do connect with us. And if you're as excited about Polkadot as I am, reach out. We're hiring for a number of different positions right now, and we're also looking for more community members to join in a number of different technical and non-technical roles. So connect with us either here or on various social channels and get involved. And so thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Next up is Olivier from Pando, AraCon Nest recipient. Welcome, Olivier.
Okay, mic is working this time. Hi everyone, so still Olivier, lead dev of the Pando team, a project funded by the AraCon Nest program. So what we are working on is distributed VCS, like a decentralized alternative to Git, right? So I'm going to try to explain you what we've been working on the last couple of months and what we intend to work on the next couple of months. Still a tech issue. So how work Pando if you take like the architectural level? Well, in the end, it's pretty simple. Each time you want to publish a new version of your code base, like create a commit, basically, then all your code base is like snapshotted, pushed to an IPFS node, pinned to make it like publicly accessible. Then we create a bunch of IPLD data sets, like to describe the commit, who has created the commit, what is the message related to the commit, what are the parents commit to preserve the history tree. And then we take the root hash of this data set and just send it to a custom AraCon app saying, okay, that's the new head of the repo I'd like to submit to you. Do whatever you want with it, merge it, reject it, stuff like that. So the overall architecture is pretty simple, and actually the hard part was that we have been rewriting a whole VCS from scratch. So often people ask, why are you doing that, right? I mean, we have Git, Git works well, Git is already decentralized. So there are a couple of reasons why we decided not to use Git and go with our own thing. Some of them are like kind of technical issues. For instance, let's say you don't want to store your commit on chain because it's way too expensive with respect to gas costs, but you may want to make sure that when someone push a new commit, it's not going to break your whole history tree, right? So you would like to make sure that this commit, even though it's not stored on chain, you just store its hash, contains the right information not to break the history tree. So you have to make sure that this piece of data is contained into the data set of which you only have the hash. And it's quite tricky to make that with Git because of the hash algorithm used by Git, stuff like that. And this is something we can do with Pando because we have been building our own IPLD resolver. So the way we serialize data, the hashing algorithm we use allows us to check that this whole history tree, even though it's not stored on chain, is going to be consistent because we can check for the hash of this data. But there are more, let's say, important or deep reasons why we don't rely on Git, because we think that Git is not Web3 compatible in the end, okay? And that's kind of feel weird because everyone is saying, okay, Git is already decentralized, so why not? This is true, but in the same time, when we talk about decentralization, it can mean a lot of different things. And we can take inspiration from this article from Vitalik about what decentralization is and try to say, okay, there's at least three different things in decentralization. One is architectural decentralization, like technical decentralization. The other one is political decentralization, and the last one is logical decentralization. So when it comes to architectural decentralization, people always say that Git is decentralized, and that's partially true because actually you can take any kind of Git repo, clone it locally, and then you can spawn your own server to like offer it to the world. So obviously with Pando we are trying to push things a little further by replicating the data on the IPFS distributed file system, the logic on the Ethereum blockchain. The idea being to avoid the kind of infrastructure shutdown we are used to when GitHub goes down and then everyone gets unemployed for the day. But the most interesting part is about the political decentralization, right? Who has rights over the code? And this is where things get really tricky with Git, because Git has been built with this idea of the push rights, okay, which has given birth to this idea of maintainers, whose task is really hard. And so basically you have this small group of people who have push rights over a repo, and the other one who don't. And even that feature, like the pull request feature, which has been introduced by GitHub and all other well-known Git platforms, is not even a part of the native Git protocol. Actually it is. You can create pull requests, but then you have to send it by mails to probably the new store vault or something like that, so it's not really hyper convenient. So with Pando we have decided to take the other way around. We still have something like push rights over a repo, but these rights are handled by the AraCon OS ACL feature. So basically you can grant these push rights to a wallet address, so it's going to become a maintainer, right? But it becomes really interesting when you grant this push rights to a voting application. And obviously that's what makes Pando interesting, I guess. So what we have been working on right now is like a simple governance scheme, but anyone can develop its own governance scheme on top of Pando. And this governance scheme is basically a voting scheme where the way it works is like, okay, when you want to push a new commit, it just kind of open a pull request automatically. And then all the token holders of the DAO are invited to come and vote on your pull request to decide whether or not they want to merge that pull request, whether they want to reject it. But they are also invited to quantify the value of this pull request, because it's not the same whether it's like minor typo fix in the README, or it's like a pull request like pushing a brand new feature into your code base. So people are invited to quantify the value of this pull request, as subjective as it may be, and then we have a weighted average mechanism which is going to grant a given value to this pull request. And in the end, if this pull request is eventually merged, then the guy who created the commit is going to be rewarded with a given amount of what we call native lineage token, which is going to acknowledge the fact that he has been a contributor to that repo. And this NLT token are going to help him to gain an authority over the repo, like an authorship share over the repo. So the next time someone pushes a pull request, well, thanks to this contribution, you're going to be able to vote on the pull request to decide whether or not you want to accept it, what's the value, what's the importance of that pull request. We think it's important because it allows us to decentralize the governance of such code-based repo, but it's also important for the sustainability of open source, because it means that every contributor to the repo is tracked, and then if this repo gains an income at some point, then it's going to be able to be split amongst all the token holders, which means all the people who have actually contributed to that code base. The last point is about logical centralization, and actually Git is pretty decentralized about that, because when you have multiple clones of the same repo, no one of them has more authority than the other about what is the real version of this code base, right? There is no central point of authority. Actually, that's not quite all blockchain work and how Pando work, because the whole point about blockchain is to have a super decentralized system to, in the end, have a single source of trust, single source of authority. And so that's how Pando work. Obviously, the remote repo, the on-chain repo, have more authority than the local one you clone in your local repository. And that's important to us because it allows us to enforce the logical integrities of the contribution and dependency tracking process. Basically, Pando is not just a versioning tracking system. It's also, it's meant to be a lineage tracking system, which means every contributor, every software dependencies, but maybe also the fork your repo come from are supposed to be tracked, so that one more time, it's all about open source sustainability, because the idea is to say, okay, guys, I'm building this open source library. I don't have to figure out like an economic model, because if lots of people use my library, well, at some point there will be a project with a given economic model, and maybe it's going to get like an earning on the blockchain, and then this earning is going to be split, and it will flow up all the way up to the dependency tree or to the lineage tree. So the idea is to be able to share this income with all your contribution and with all your dependencies. Okay, it's demo time, so I had planned to make a real-life demo, and then I realized that you wouldn't be able to see anything on the screen, so I just took a picture, a video, and kind of zoom. So that's the CLI of Pando. The last version is not published on MPN yet, but you will be able to download it like next week. Otherwise, you can just clone the repo locally and play with it. So that's when a month of work just looked like someone using Git on the screen. It's not super interesting, but basically it's like Git, though you have kind of a different workflow. For instance, you have this fibers mechanism, which are kind of like Git branches, except that these fibers are totally independent, so you always have this problem when you work with Git and you want to switch from one branch to another, where you have to commit your changes even though you don't want, or you have to stash them, and it's kind of a mess. In Pando, all the fibers are totally independent, so you can easily switch from one to another without like being scared about this kind of conflicts. The other one is the tracking system. Basically, in Git, you have to explicitly tell when you want to add a file into a commit. In Pando, you can just track a file, and then all the modifications are going to be taken into account for all the upcoming commits. If you say that you don't want to, of course, it won't happen. So we've taken a lot of inspiration from Gitless about that, which is some kind of another layer of Git, which has thought a lot about Git design flows. You can also like automatically deploy AraCon DAO from the CLI. So basically what it does is like it go and fetch a specific DAO kit, which is an AraCon package manager package, and it automatically install all the related Pando apps, set the permission and all. So that's the CLI, and the magic happens when you just like try to commit. So you give the name of your DAO. Let's say AraCon Blacks, that's like the name of your GitHub organization, except it's not on GitHub, it's like an AraCon DAO. Then the name of your repo. And then we have been building this content for the AraCon client. Still kind of minimalistic, but we are still working on it. So you have this RFI. RFI are the equivalent of pull request. We have built buildings that IPFS browsing components that you can browse your code base. We have basic syntax and Lightning, still trying to polish that, and then we are going to try to push that to the AraCon UI package so that everyone can leverage on it. And then you have this little interface which allows you to quantify the value of your pull request. So let's say, okay, that guy did a good job, let's grant him like 2 NLT token, which will acknowledge the value of this contribution to my code base. So here it is, it's done now. And then you can say, okay, now if that pull request is merged, then the guy is going to be rewarded with that 2 token. And it's important to mention that these tokens are not meant to be transferable. They are not currency tokens. They are just meant to acknowledge your contribution to the repo, even though we have a hook which allows the DAOs to say, okay, automatically when someone gets granted NLT token thanks to his contribution, we can also reward him with like project-wide tokens such as NT or things like that. So like right now, the pull request is merged, and that's it. You've been rewarded, and it's going to keep track of this contribution in the whole history of the project. So what's next? Well, a lot, obviously. One other thing we're still working on is to build this semantic lineage tree, which is about, okay, how do we describe the relationship between all these contributions, the forks, the dependencies, and maybe we can provide some semantic rich descriptive language to say, that person has been contributed as a developer, that one has contributed as a designer, that one has contributed as a maintainer, stuff like that. Also, we want to work with that planning suite application, which has been demoed yesterday, which is totally awesome. So obviously, we want to have some integration between that planning suite and Pando. Add some like database or distributed database component to allow for people to open in a decentralized way issues and track these issues. Work further on the AraCon PM integration. That's also one of the reasons why we published a blog article like 2 days ago to announce that we are running for Flock, so we are going to push a proposal to become an AraCon team under the name of AraCon Black. The idea being to keep on developing Pando and integrating all of the things we've learned by developing Pando more tightly into the AraCon stack, help decentralize AraCon development too, and make it like the go-to choice when it comes to like decentralized and open source projects. So come and read the article, come and use the CLI and all the AraCon apps. The AraCon apps are going to be published on Rinkeby soon so that you can play with them. And yes, give us as much feedback as you can, guys, because in the end we are building this for you to play with it and to use it. So give us as much feedback as you can. We will be super happy. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so a few announcements before we kick off our panel. So we have some workshops in the breakout rooms after lunch. So at 2 o'clock, Ramp has Kendall's Bank, Exploring Open Banking. And that'll be downstairs around registration. And then at 3:30, there will be Clement from Claros. We'll have a practical introduction to voting systems. And I have another announcement here somewhere. Griff wanted me to say, if you want to help Griff and Giveth and a bunch of other folks help kickstart the AraCon co-op, go to the down by registration after Luis's closing keynote. All right, now our panel. So this is the current state of TCRs, token curated registries, all the rage in 2018. So this is moderated by Luke Duncan from AraCon 1. Come on up. You get to throw that. Hopefully you throw it better than I did yesterday.
Oh yeah.
And our panelists, Trent McConaughey from Ocean, PJ Limegruber from District 0x, and Jeff Emmett from Giveth and AraCon. Take it away, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you.
Cool, I'm excited for this. Before we get started, do you guys want to do like a quick round, introduce yourself, talk about what you're working on, why you're on this panel?
Sure. I'm Trent McConaughey. Spent 20 years doing AI, and then for the last 5 years been full-time in blockchain. And my main focus is Ocean Protocol, which is essentially decentralizing AI. And we've done a lot of sort of token engineering type work towards designing Ocean, and shared a lot of those thinking that probably is one of the reasons I'm on this panel, I guess. So in doing the AI work, we did a lot of AI for chip design, so building actual software tools for people designing computer chips. So I see that there's a lot of learnings from that industry that can be applied towards token engineering.
My name is PJ Limegruber, coming to you from Los Angeles, California. So flew a very long way to get here, and I'm really excited to be here. I'm part of the District 0x team. I'm actually the marketing lead for District 0x. So one of the non-technical people you'll hear from today. Outside of District 0x, I'm also a professor at the University of Southern California. I'm currently teaching a class on digital marketing, and for the past year and a half, I've been working on building and getting approved a blockchain miner that we are in the last stages of approval for. So if everything goes according to plan, we'll be teaching and developing blockchain curriculum for university credit in the next 1 to 2 years. So very excited about that.
Cool. My name's Jeff Emmett. I'm working with Giveth to build the future of giving, and that is ensuring transparent donations directly from donors to change makers, and also keeping those accountable through funding dispersed when milestones are completed by these projects. And I've also been working closely with Block Science, who is an R&D firm who is working to forward the practice of token engineering, and make sure that we are rigorously designing and simulating these crypto economic models like TCRs before we deploy them into production.
Cool, thanks guys. So kind of, I think we should start with, first of all, what is a TCR, and why is it kind of taken so much of the collective attention in the like Ethereum and blockchain space in the past like year and a half or so?
I can give a quick definition. It's simply a set, and it's a pattern, just like the idea in computer science of software design patterns. And I think it happened to be a sufficiently simple pattern that's easy for people to conceptualize and deploy, and had some nice mechanics for joining this list and exiting the list and so on that kind of made sense. We'll probably get into there's probably flaws too, but overall it's simply a set, and there's lots of variants.
To give a very simple explanation, think of TCR as a curated list, right? So think about a list you would go to on TripAdvisor that has a list of very popular restaurants, right? In a TCR model, a collective group of people would control that list and say, we believe for either objective or subjective reasons why this restaurant should or should not be listed on this list, right? And the goal of a TCR is to incentivize participation for the participants to challenge applications for restaurants, in this case, to be on this list, to say, yes, I believe this restaurant should be on here, or no, they shouldn't. So if you Google TCRs, we have a video, an animated video that I spent a very long time making about what is a TCR. So if you want to get caught up on that, it's a great resource.
Yeah, I think list making is a very important aspect of humans and how we organize informations. And as we move into decentralized organizations, we need decentralized structures for curating and organizing that information so that we can determine the most important priorities to work on.
Cool. Yeah, it seems like the idea of curating a set, as you say, is kind of valuable in a lot of various different applications, and a wide range of different use cases. I'm wondering, based on that like criteria, is it just a set that we can apply the pattern, the design pattern of a TCR for, or are there other data structures that also make sense to follow the same pattern and apply these same concepts to?
Well, I think there's a few. Overall, yes, there's a lot of potential patterns, and we've seen more emerging. And if you look at the history of patterns in software engineering, they started emerging in the mid-90s as a wiki. In fact, one of the people who invented the wiki started populating this list called the Philadelphia repository, basically. And in there was very simple patterns like abstract, factory, and many others basically. And over time, they evolved and evolved and evolved to end up as a book and sort of unlock this overall field of software engineering. I see that TCRs are one of the very first patterns that are well-defined, that are practical and usable in the world of designing tokenized ecosystems. And people have been deploying them. There are several TCRs that are live, and they haven't failed miserably. In fact, seem to be doing fairly well, which is promising, right? And then that's a lot different compared to say a year and a half ago when it was still sort of theory and ideas. There are other things. Probably the most closely related one. Well, there's a few variants of TCRs with actually orders in the list, or grouping together a few of them to layer them and so on. And they each have their own use cases. And beyond that, you go into bonding curves, and all of that is really about curation of some different data structures. Beyond that, you have building blocks for governance, you have third-party arbitration, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a really great start, though, for this overall sort of set of building blocks that we can use and reuse in crypto.
Anybody else?
I think they can be used also as important signaling mechanisms, not necessarily ordering discrete lists, sets on a list, but signaling mechanisms for how we can aggregate the collective preference of society and determine sort of how we can make headway against these intractable kind of supranational global problems, climate change or any other global issue.
Cool. Yeah. And some of these are launched experiments. There's TCRs in production, and we've been able to examine how they're operating, how people are using them, how they're interacting. Have we learned anything from these experiments that are informing currently in progress designs? If we're applying this to our own projects, what are the things that we can learn from the people that have already pushed these to production?
I'm happy to take this first, but I don't want to always be first, so maybe I'll defer to someone else.
Well, I think a common thing that detracts from TCRs is are we creating an echo chamber, right? If the goal is to seek out subjectivity of what the best X, Y, or Z item is, but the community of people that are doing that are all part of the same community, are we really truly arriving at an answer that's subjective? And I think creating structures and creating TCRs and getting people, getting something that has a wide enough reach and a wide enough scope that will, get a population or a sample size that's large enough to achieve subjectivity, I don't think we've done that yet in TCRs.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's, minimum economy size for a working TCR, where again, a lot of this is trial and error, and failure is learning in an experimental space like this. So I think it's important that there are all these projects that are forging ahead and experimenting wildly. And I think that we'll see successes, we'll see failures, and all of it's important to the learning process. And I'm excited about the the kind of burgeoning token engineering movement, which Trent is a big part of, and block science as well, in kind of synthesizing those failures into new models that we can experiment with in the future.
Yeah, kind of my view seeing is, are there examples of failures out there? And a way of reframing this question is, how do you verify a tokenized ecosystem? And then, one way to verify it is just to not simulate or not verify at all, and just to launch it and watch it fail, right? But there's actually other ways. You can do just simple, like talking over beers with friends, or sending your white paper to design and seeing them thrash it and kill it, and then try to improve. And that's actually really useful. Call it human simulation, if you will, right? And then there's software-based simulation, which is like the block sciences guys and others are doing a very nice job on. It's very nascent field, but it's getting going. And then the third way is economic, where it's actually having real stake in the game and using blockchains as bug bounty systems. If an issue is there, then people will find it and exploit it. And this is actually exactly what happened with AdChain in its early days. And that's really great, because the AdChain guys could address it. But ideally, you don't have to lose too much skin in the game with deploying live before you actually try some of the other techniques first. So in our case, in building Ocean, in the white paper initially, we had a TCR for sort of this global registry of good actors. But then from feedback from several people, they said, will this really scale to a community of 10,000, 100,000 people, right? And the answer is no, right? At least not a flat TCR. There's going to be diminishing returns for every single person that enters. So after you get past 100 or 1,000 people, are they really worth? Is it really worth taking the risk to have person number 1001, right? And that's a real problem. The other problem that I saw, and this is once again simply from human simulation, they're very gatekeepery, right? And here in blockchain land, we are trying to remove gates and lower the threshold and not have permissions where we can. So to actually try to signal that you care, you have to do largely off-chain signaling in order to say that you're good enough to join this on-chain registry. And so these are a couple problems that baseline TCRs have. There are several proposed solutions, et cetera, around. But this is the sort of thing that you can find just with human simulation even, right? Without even needing to go to software simulation or to economic-based.
Yeah, really, really fascinating. There's a couple of things to unpack there. Scalability of this mechanism is a really big question, and in my mind, kind of an unknown question, both in the entire blockchain space, but specifically for TCRs. Is this something that we can envision actually reaching like large-scale adoption? How do people interact with these things? What needs to change in order for that to scale?
That's a great question. So at District 0x, we're building a TCR called Meme Factory. And at least the hypothesis is that by creating a TCR for deciding which meme should be allowed into a meme marketplace, we can effectively start to curate the dankest memes, if you will. The thought, and at least the hope of, I think, of any crypto project is that it breaks out of the community and it goes into the mainstream. And CryptoKitties had that success. And at least our hypothesis is there's so many memes are so commonplace on the internet, and they're all over Reddit. And if we can create this system where we can definitively say these memes are new, these memes are original, and I knew about this meme early. I hopped on the train early, and Meme Factory, the TCR Meme Factory allows you to do that. So at least that's our hypothesis to achieve some sort of scale is by placing a TCR in something that everyone that's involved in the internet at least knows about.
Yeah, like make it socially scalable by making it fun, right?
Exactly, socially scalable by making it fun.
Yeah.
I think also, determining the right place for use in TCRs. I mean, TCRs are a neat way that you can decentrally curate a list, but it's a bit overkill for a shopping list. It's a bit overkill for a lot of lists that we make fairly effectively, at the level of corporations or households or whatever else. I think TCRs can provide a nice kind of like supranational structure for decision making and ordering of information and priorities. But I think there's going to be a lot of experimentation before we can get to that level for sure.
Here's a couple examples of designs to help scale. One of them is rather than if sort of a global blockchain, rather than have one sort of global TCR, you localize to the groups. So within Ocean, there's different tribes, if you will, that care. There's a group of people that really care about autonomous driving data. There's another group of people that really care about medical data for Parkinson's, et cetera. So and that group can have a set of permissions around accessing that data. So how do you curate that? It can be a TCR. Or it can be simply you get a certificate saying that you were vetted by medical authorities. So kind of how we envision entering and exiting these tribes, it's basically an AraCon DAO for governance of joining this, where the governance could simply be a TCR or some other mechanism. So that's one, basically where you push to this lower level of sort of Unix-style groups or tribes, we call them. The second one is something like a layered TCR where you have, say, 3 or 4 layers, and at the bottom layer you can have 10,000, 100,000 people in there, and there's very little skin in the game to join, maybe none at all. But then if you want to get to the higher and higher ranks, where it gets tighter and tighter in the funnel, where maybe there's only 100 people on the layer 4, there's heterogeneous rules to go from one layer to the next. And we see this for things like Wikipedia, or the C4 software process, or even things like university professors. You start off at the lowest level as a TA, you work your way up to Professor Emeritus, essentially, at the end. So in a layer TCR, the bottom could easily be 10,000 people, and you're okay, right? So these are a couple ways that we see to scale. There's going to be others too, but that's at least a couple.
Cool. Yeah. Does the content of the TCR, like the specific data that you're curating, matter? I know one of the major critiques that I've seen is whether it's feasible to actually coordinate and curate subjective data, and are the applications of subjective data like going to work with a TCR, or do we need something else? Do we only need to have TCRs that curate objective data? What are you guys' thoughts on that?
I hope we disagree here. This will be fun.
So you don't want to go first.
I can if you want. No, happy to, but
I generally think that objective. So when we say objective versus subjective, right? To give you guys a very simple example, let's think about a university admissions process, right? Objective things are like, did this person graduate high school? Did this person take the right prerequisite classes? Did this person get maybe a minimum GPA or SAT score, right? These are all objective things that you can verify by looking at that person's transcript. Subjective would be things like, is this person worthy of coming to this university? You know, did they write a good enough essay? Did they do a good enough community service or do other things that are requisite for them to be admitted? So the common debate is objectivity versus subjectivity. I think objective things can be automated, and I don't necessarily know that they need a human to curate them. If you can look up these things in a database, assume that that database is trusted, then that's one less thing for the curators of the registry to have to worry about. So I think that it should focus on subjectivity, in my opinion.
I think there's a lot to be gained if we can get subjectivity agreement on subjective measures to work. I don't think we're quite there yet. I think there's a lot of work to go into properly designing these systems and making sure that when we model them and simulate them and build them, that I think they can provide greater levels of social cohesion and coherence, but we've got a ways to go before we can know that is a robust model for sure.
So I'm actually surprised because I've heard usually people say it's either both or it's just objective. So it's awesome to hear that you're saying just subjective. Cool. I'm going to argue both, and for different reasons. I think at the heart of any sort of group of people in a society, you have laws which are you have the baseline laws that are written down, very precise, and you can have common law on top of that. But then besides that, society still functions even though sometimes there's not anything written down or no case law before it. And that's because we have social norms. And social norms are basically agreements among people in a community to act in a certain way, right? And if you violate those social norms, even if it's not written down, if you violate them, the community is going to have some retribution against you somehow, right? You might get kicked out of the community or something. This maps to TCRs. Basically, the laws are the objective ones, and the social norms are the subjective ones. So, and it might be for the objective ones, maybe you use the TCR as a sort of a fast means to quickly assess something, and then if it takes, at the end of the day, third-party arbitration or some other way that's slower, great. But at least there's costly signaling up front. For the subjective, it's directly that, because it's the community that is on the TCR, it's their belief in whatever they think is correct. But for this reason, especially for the subjective TCRs, it is critical that you see that community with the values that you want, because if you don't, you could end up with chaos, right? As we've seen with, for example, when Spore got launched, right? Within weeks, we had a whole bunch of not safe for work sort of 3D artifacts bouncing around in the Spore world. My daughter's in the audience, my 6-year-old daughter, so so is Gabby here? There we go. Hi, Gabby.
So kind of building on the subjective versus objective question, because I know both you have been really involved in the token engineering space and trying to simulate and validate these things before we put them out in the world. Does the subjective nature of these things make it more difficult to simulate and validate these things without just saying, here it is, try and break it?
I can answer that. So, in fact, I was inspired. At first, I thought it's impossible because how do you model a human, right? And that would take an AI, and then everything else changes, like a general purpose ATI, et cetera. So then it's like, how do you do this? And it was actually Zargam who taught me a way. And the answer is a blockchain is moving through a state space. So let's say you have X1, X2, X3, and if you have a value for all three of those, that's the state of the system at the time. And as transactions are done on the blockchain, it's evolving through that space. Now, of course, we don't just have 3 dimensions, we have thousands, right? And then the question is, what does it take to transition from one state to the next? And this is basically what actions are allowed on the blockchain itself, right? So you can actually bound this, right, with defining what's allowed. And then what you need to do is you need to say, what is the worst case possible things that could happen? Not the probabilistic case, the worst case. The probabilistic does need modeling humans and all this. You need the worst case. And this is what we did in circuit design. You say, a circuit needs to work across all possible temperatures, all possible power conditions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then whatever the worst case performance of this, of your chip is, if it's still okay, you're good to go. That's the way that I see with this too. So there's simulation at the lowest level. One level up, you have verification. And we need verification in a worst case setting according to this bounding the state space like Zargham described. And then we're good to go.
But isn't the worst case in a subjective like model of a human somebody that's completely irrational?
So you still need to have assumptions in the model, saying, for example, like if the worst case is that you have more than 51% of the actors or 25% or whatever, then you're completely screwed, right? So you have to say, okay, I'm going to assume that no matter what, there's a few fundamental things that don't get violated, and then beyond that, you have to go worst case. Maybe I think it's going to be pretty pessimistic at first. So I hope over time we can get to models and verification that's much more probabilistic based, but it's going to take a lot of time.
Also, when you come at it from the irrational actor, you have irrational actors acting in multiple directions, which kind of balances out to just a general noise in the system. So you can also model in noise that can reflect the action of multiple irrational behaviors acting in different ways. So it is, in some way, can be built into the model that you can predict along with that behavior as well.
Yeah, and to sort of underscore, right, like a key thing here is if you assume that there's this list of possible actions that happen, you're not saying you're following some particular set of types of actors, like rational or good or otherwise. It's simply this is all possible sets of cases, right? It could be 100% irrational, and you're okay.
And I think just to add on to that, this is something that I've been speaking with Zargham at Block Science, and just kind of a different way to look at social signals, and I believe he has some electrical engineering background. I believe Trent does as well. I do myself, and using error correcting codes. So when we send signals in electronics, we have error correcting codes that we want to make sure there wasn't packets lost in between. So we have kind of these signals that ensure coherent message. And we've been talking about potentially applying error correcting codes in social signals coming from TCRs or curation markets to try and determine, a coherent social signal, which would be a really interesting field of research, I think.
That's super cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, really cool. We're running low on time. I want to cover this one last topic that's really interesting. I want to hear your opinions on alternative structures for TCRs to allow ranked lists. Like the canonical example is typically like a whitelist or a blacklist of entries. You're either on the list or you're off the list. But there's certain types of applications where you need to actually know the order of the list. And I'm curious what your thoughts are, if you've put in any thought into like what variations on this model can allow for ordered sets.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think ordered sets get very, very interesting to potentially for businesses. Like if we were to look at a Yelp, right? A Yelp is an ordered list of restaurants in a different category, the best Mexican restaurant or the best seafood restaurant. For those business owners, there's substantial financial outcome for them to be top on the list. Same thing with being top for a search result on Google. So I think when you apply that, there's value in being on a list and value in being included in a list. And I think people that curate the list would want their list to be seen as valuable. So I think under those assumptions, yeah, I do think that there would be ways to curate a list where ranked order is very, very important. I don't necessarily know that that's the biggest problem facing TCRs, but I do think there are scenarios where the ranks are extremely important.
Another type of TCR that I've been discussing with Block Science that I'm pretty excited about is something we're calling conviction voting, which is kind of a continuous preference broadcast. Rather than having a vote that occurs on Wednesday, for a 72-hour period, you are continuously broadcasting your preference for everything in the list at any given time. And this is much more biomimetic. It's designing as nature. When decisions happen in nature, it doesn't happen on a Wednesday. It happens continuously. So this would be an interesting another area of research that to see if we can make that work.
Yeah, there's out there in the world of the blockchain literature, i.e. Medium, Sebastian Gadzik wrote an article called Graded TCRs. That was quite a nice approach to this. And then kind of more broadly in the sort of set of just space of TCRs, Matt Lockyer wrote a blog post that sort of synthesized about 6 or 7 of these different patterns. So graded TCRs, layered TCRs, sort of trees of them nested. And there's a way to generalize all of this too, to where you're basically going from one set of actors to another, and it could be in a DAG. And that's what Dimitri de Jong kind of invented a couple years ago, what he calls stake machines. So S-T-A-K-E, not to be confused with S-T-E-A-K, because there is that one as well.
Too.
Yeah, there is that one too. So anyway, that's stake machines, and that's a generalized way, sort of, moving from one group of individuals to another via this DAG, right? So I think there's quite a few, and you don't have to rely on TCR as well. For example, if every single actor had its own bonding curve attached to it, then you can rank simply to how much liquidity is tied up in each bonding curve. So there's a lot of other options beyond the sort of classical TCR type way of thinking.
Cool. I think we're pretty much out of time, so I don't think we have enough time for another question. But thank you guys so much. That was enlightening.
Thank you.
We could talk all day.
Happy to. Thank you.
Thank you.